Welcome to Brada Tales. Tonight, prepare yourself for hours of captivating adventures and enchanting discoveries as we take you into a world where fairy tale fantasy blends seamlessly with the calming sound of rain, perfect for unwinding. Before you drift off, let us know where you're tuning in from and the time in the comments below. If these stories spark your imagination, remember to like, share, and subscribe. Now settle in, get comfortable, and let your mind wander freely.
The lurking fog. As I made my way through the dense forest, the frigid evening air nipped at my exposed skin. The sun had long since set, leaving a suffocating darkness to envelop the towering trees around me. A deep sense of unease settled in the pit of my stomach, an instinctive warning that something was amiss in these woods. I quickened my pace, desperate to reach the safety of home. But with each step, the shadows seemed to close in, distorting the familiar path. An unsettling silence hung in the air, broken only by the occasional crack of a twig or rustle of leaves. Then, without warning, a thick fog began to roll in, swirling and billowing around me. It was as if the very forest itself was exhaling a chilling breath, enveloping me in its eerie embrace. I strained to see through the impenetrable haze, my heart pounding in my ears. The path I had traversed countless times before had vanished, leaving me disoriented and utterly alone. A shiver ran down my spine as my eyes played tricks on me. Were those shadowy figures moving between the trees? I squinted, desperate to make sense of the shapes emerging from the fog, but they seemed to melt back into the mist the moment I focused on them. The air grew colder, the fog denser, and a sense of dread crept up my spine. I pressed on, my footsteps muffled by the damp ground. But with each passing moment, the forest felt more and more unfamiliar, as if the very landscape had shifted and changed around me. I could no longer tell which way I had come or which way led home. The fog had become my captor, obscuring my vision and enveloping me in its haunting embrace. As I stood, paralyzed by fear, a bone-chilling sound pierced the silence, a deep, guttural growl that seemed to reverberate through the very air itself. My blood ran cold, and I knew, in that moment, that I was no longer alone. My heart pounded in my chest as I strained to pinpoint the source of the ominous growl. The fog had become so thick that I could barely see a few feet in front of me, obscuring any potential threat. Frantically, I scanned the swirling mist, my eyes darting from one shadowy outline to the next. Was that a hulking figure lurking behind that tree? Or merely a trick of the light filtering through the haze? I took a tentative step backward, every nerve ending on high alert. The sounds of the forest had all but vanished, replaced by an eerie silence that only heightened my sense of isolation and vulnerability. Suddenly, a movement to my left caught my eye, and I whirled around, heart racing. There, barely visible through the fog, was a shape unlike anything I had ever seen before. It was massive, with a vaguely humanoid form, yet its proportions seemed distorted, unnatural. As it shifted, a low, guttural rumble echoed through the trees, sending a chill down my spine. I stood paralyzed, transfixed by the sheer size and presence of this creature. It seemed to loom over me, its breath rasping and labored, as if it were some ancient, primordial being that had emerged from the depths of the earth itself. Instinctively, I knew that I was in the presence of something utterly alien and deeply, profoundly dangerous. Without warning, the creature lunged forward, its massive form surging through the fog with shocking speed. I recoiled, stumbling backward in a desperate attempt to escape its grasp. But the fog had become a prison, trapping me, disorienting me, as the creature's clawed hands reached out, intent on seizing me. I turned and ran, my legs pumping furiously as I crashed through the underbrush, desperate to put distance between myself and the relentless pursuit. The forest seemed to shift and change around me, the familiar landmarks obscured by the ever-thickening fog. I could hear the creature's heavy footsteps behind me, its guttural roars echoing through the trees, spurring me on. Lungs burning, legs aching, I plunged through the treacherous terrain, branches whipping in my face as I ran. The creature's deafening roars spurred me onward, fueling a primal terror that threatened to consume me. I darted between the towering trunks, searching frantically for any sign of the familiar path home. But the fog had erased all sense of direction, leaving me lost and disoriented. Every turn, every shadow, held the promise of the creature's looming presence, stalking me, drawing ever closer. As I rounded a bend, I caught a glimpse of a weathered wooden sign through the mist of the trailhead, a beacon of hope in this nightmare. With renewed vigor, I pushed myself forward, desperate to reach the safety of the main trail. But just as I closed the distance, the sign vanished, swallowed by the ever-shifting fog. Panic gripped me as I stumbled to a halt, chest heaving. The creature's thunderous footsteps grew louder, closer, until I could feel the very ground trembling beneath my feet. Whirling around, I caught a glimpse of its massive silhouette emerging from the haze, its glowing eyes fixed upon me. Without a moment's hesitation, I darted off the trail, plunging deeper into the unknown recesses of the forest. The underbrush clawed at my skin, the branches tearing at my clothes, but I pressed on, driven by sheer desperation. I could hear the creature crashing through the foliage behind me, its snarls echoing through the trees. Time seemed to slow as I ran, every second an eternity. The fog swirled around me, disorienting and disruptive, until I could no longer tell which way I had come or where I was heading. The once familiar forest had become a labyrinth of terror, a living nightmare that threatened to consume me. As I rounded a towering oak, I caught sight of a small, dilapidated structure in the distance, a derelict cabin, long abandoned and forgotten. Without hesitation, I changed course, scrambling toward the weathered building, driven by the desperate hope of finding shelter, a moment's respite from the relentless pursuit. As I neared the dilapidated cabin, a flicker of hope ignited within me. Perhaps, within its weathered walls, I could find refuge from the monstrous presence that had pursued me through the treacherous fog. Without pausing to consider the risks, I darted toward the ramshackle structure, the creature's thunderous footsteps growing ever closer behind me. The door hung ajar, its hinges creaking in protest as I shouldered it open and slipped inside, slamming it shut with a resounding thud. The interior was cloaked in darkness, the musty air thick with the scent of decay. Frantically, I searched for a way to barricade the entrance, my hands trembling as I stacked a rickety table against the doorway. A deafening roar from outside shook the very foundation of the cabin, and I froze, my heart pounding in my ears. Pressing myself against the wall, I strained to hear any sign of movement, any indication that the creature had followed me into this forgotten sanctuary. For what felt like an eternity, the only sound was the ragged rhythm of my own desperate breathing. Slowly, cautiously, I began to explore the cabin, my eyes gradually adjusting to the gloom. Cobwebs clung to every surface, and the floorboards creaked ominously beneath my feet. The air was thick with the stale scent of neglect, a tangible reminder of the years that had passed since this place had last seen human habitation. As I made my way deeper into the cabin, a sliver of moonlight filtered through a grimy window, casting an eerie glow over the room. My breath caught in my throat as I caught sight of a tattered, weathered photograph, its subjects obscured by the passing of time. Gingerly, I reached out to touch the fragile frame, a haunting sense of unease washing over me. Suddenly, a loud crash from the direction of the door jolted me from my reverie. The creature had found me, its massive form slamming against the makeshift barricade. I scrambled backward, heart pounding, as the cabin trembled under the onslaught. The table groaned and splintered, and I knew that my fragile sanctuary would not hold for long. Desperate, I searched the cabin for any means of escape, my eyes landing on a trapdoor in the far corner of the room. Without hesitation, I rushed toward it, pulling it open to reveal a narrow staircase leading down into the unknown depths beneath the cabin. Casting one last terrified glance at the shattering door, I took a deep breath and descended into the darkness, praying that it would offer the salvation I so desperately sought. The narrow staircase descended into inky blackness, the only sound the pounding of my heart and the distant, ominous rumbles from above. Gripping the splintered handrail, I cautiously made my way down, each step a test of my fraying nerves. As I reached the bottom, my hands searched the wall, desperate to find some means of illumination. My fingers brushed against a rusted lantern, and with trembling hands, I lit the wick, casting a warm glow over the cramped, musty space. I found myself in a small cellar, filled with discarded furniture and the detritus of forgotten lives. Cobwebs clung to every corner, and the air was thick with the scent of decay. Yet, despite the oppressive atmosphere, a sliver of hope flickered within me. Perhaps, in this forgotten crypt, I could find a way to evade the creature that had pursued me. Steeling my nerves, I began to explore the cellar, searching for any sign of an exit. The sound of the creature's relentless assault on the cabin above echoed through the confined space, a constant reminder of the peril that lurked just beyond my fragile sanctuary. As I moved deeper into the cellar, my foot struck something solid, and I looked down to find a trapdoor set into the floor. Crouching down, I grasped the rusted handle and pulled, the wood and metal groaning in protest. To my relief, the trapdoor swung open, revealing a narrow tunnel that seemed to stretch into the darkness. Without hesitation, I descended the rickety ladder, my eyes straining to make out the path ahead. The tunnel was cramped and oppressive, the air thick with the scent of earth and decay. But as I pressed forward, a faint glimmer of light in the distance gave me a renewed sense of hope. Suddenly, the ground beneath me began to tremble, the sound of the creature's roars growing deafening. It had breached the cabin, and now it was hunting me, its massive form crashing through the tunnel in pursuit. Panic surged through me, and I scrambled forward, driven by a primal need to escape. The light grew brighter, and I could see the end of the tunnel approaching. With a final burst of speed, I emerged into a small, dank chamber, only to find that it was a dead end. Trapped, with the creature's thunderous footsteps drawing ever closer, I pressed myself against the wall, my last desperate hope fading into the encompassing darkness. As the creature's massive silhouette filled the tunnel's entrance, its glowing eyes boring into me, I knew that there was nowhere left to run. In that moment, all I could do was brace myself for the reckoning that awaited me in the depths of the unyielding abyss. The office desk. Starting a new job is always nerve-wracking, even if you've been through it a few times. So, when I landed a position in an office in Virginia, I expected the usual jitters, wondering if I'd fit in, if my manager would be tough, and if I'd somehow spill coffee on my shirt before the first meeting. The building was like any other, part of a corporate strip with a neat beige facade and a small lobby filled with artificial plants. I was greeted with polite, slightly distracted smiles as I was shown around on my first day. The team seemed friendly enough, the kind of people who knew their way around their tasks and had fallen into familiar routines. As I took my assigned spot, a desk tucked in the far corner near a tall, narrow window, I immediately noticed something odd about it. Unlike the other desks in the office, which were sleek and modern, mine looked, well, worn. The surface was scratched in places, and the wood was visibly older, with faint scuff marks around the edges. I had the distinct feeling that it had seen more than its fair share of use. A bit of harmless office quirk, I told myself, sitting down. Maybe they'd just never gotten around to replacing it. I reached down to open a drawer and found it stuck, requiring a few tugs before it finally gave way with a soft, reluctant creak. Inside were a few odds and ends left behind by the previous user: an old, dried-out pen, a single paperclip, and a yellowed sheet of paper with faint, barely legible scribbles on it. Nothing particularly unusual, but I couldn't shake the impression that this desk was somehow different. It was one of those quiet evenings where time seemed to stretch. My second week at the job, and I was already staying late to wrap up a project. One by one, my coworkers filtered out, each saying a quick goodnight, until I was the only one left. The silence that followed their departure felt heavy, almost palpable, settling over the office like a thick blanket. Outside, dusk had turned into night, and the narrow window beside my desk showed only my faint reflection against the darkness. The overhead lights cast long shadows across the room, creating an odd, unsettling contrast between the brightly lit spaces and the darkened corners. Then, just as I was leaning back, ready to call it a night, the screen on my computer flickered to life. I hadn't touched the mouse or keyboard. In fact, I'd already started shutting things down. I leaned forward, frowning, wondering if maybe it was just an automatic update or a glitch. But before I could think of anything else, words began to appear on the screen, one letter at a time. "Leave this place," it spelled out, clear as day. I felt my breath hitch. I blinked, half expecting the message to disappear or change into some sort of error. But it stayed, each letter bright against the dark screen, almost daring me to react. I reached out to touch the keyboard, hesitating. My logical mind insisted it was just a prank, maybe even a leftover joke from whoever used this desk before me. Yet, a deep unease crawled up my spine. The message felt personal. Just as I opened a new window to check for any signs of remote access, the screen glitched again, blinking for a split second. When it stabilized, the words were gone, replaced by my regular desktop. I laughed nervously, convincing myself it was just a bizarre software issue or maybe my mind playing tricks after a long day. Still, as I grabbed my things to leave, I couldn't shake the sensation that I was being watched, like unseen eyes were following me all the way out of the building. I closed my laptop with a quick, decisive motion, hoping the firm click of the lid would put an end to my rising unease. But as I glanced around the empty office, that feeling, the unmistakable sensation of being watched, lingered, prickling the back of my neck. Taking a steadying breath, I reminded myself that the office was empty. There was no one here but me. But no matter how much I tried to rationalize, something felt wrong. The air had grown inexplicably cold, the kind of chill that sinks past your skin and settles deep into your bones. I rubbed my arms, shivering, wondering if the building's heating had somehow shut off. Then, from somewhere in the distance, I heard a faint sound. It was subtle at first, barely audible, but it grew steadily louder, as if something, or someone, was moving slowly through the office. A shuffle, a faint creak, then silence. I held my breath, straining to hear any further sounds, but all was still. My rational mind tried to argue that it was nothing more than the natural creaks and groans of an old building settling. But deep down, I knew it was something else. Just as I turned back to gather my things, the screen of my laptop lit up once more. This time, I hadn't touched it. It simply blinked to life, and, once again, words began to appear, letter by slow, deliberate letter. They took everything from US. My heart raced as I stared, frozen, at the screen. My fingers hovered over the keyboard, trembling slightly. The words didn't disappear this time. They stayed there, stark and unyielding, almost as if demanding to be seen. A chill slid down my spine as I took in the message. They took everything from us. I sat there, staring at the message on the screen, my heart pounding in my chest. This had to have an explanation, I told myself. Maybe a virus had infected my computer, some sort of bizarre prank software that spat out random phrases. Or perhaps the IT team was testing a program and hadn't warned anyone. I clung to these possibilities, but the lingering dread gnawed at me, whispering that this was something far stranger. Trying to shake off the feeling, I took a deep breath and forced myself to act casual, glancing around the dim office as if it were just any other evening. But my nerves were frayed, and every small sound, the hum of the air conditioning, the faint buzz of the fluorescent lights, seemed sharper, somehow menacing. I felt the urge to get up and leave, but I didn't want to rush and look foolish, even if no one was there to see it. Instead, I began to pack my things slowly, my movements careful and deliberate. Yet with every second, my senses were on high alert, as if tuned to pick up on something lurking just out of sight. That's when I heard it. Footsteps. Quiet, deliberate, moving slowly down the corridor toward my corner. The sound of each step echoed through the silent office, the soft thud of shoes on carpet mixed with the occasional creak of the floorboards. I froze, my hand halfway to my bag, straining to listen. "Who's there?" I whispered, more to calm myself than anything. There was no reply. But as I peered toward the end of the room, a shape, a dark, indistinct shadow, hovered just beyond the reach of the nearest light. It was impossible to tell if it was a person or just a trick of the eyes, but it seemed to shift, almost pulsing, as if watching me. My stomach twisted, and I forced myself to look away, rationalizing that it had to be a reflection or a misplaced piece of furniture casting a strange shadow. Yet, as much as I tried to convince myself, I could feel my pulse racing, every instinct screaming at me to leave. I could barely catch my breath as I stood there, trying to force myself to move. "Just grab your things and go," I told myself. But that shadowy figure at the end of the room, it was as if it held me in place, a silent presence, waiting. Before I could take a step, my laptop screen lit up once more, casting a cold, pale glow over the desk. Against my better judgment, I looked down, unable to ignore the words that were now appearing on the screen. "They wouldn't let us leave. And you won't leave either." I swallowed hard, feeling a chill claw its way up my spine. My hands were shaking as I shoved my laptop into my bag, barely bothering to zip it up. Every instinct screamed at me to get out of there, to put as much distance between myself and this place as possible. With one last glance toward the end of the room, where the shadow had seemed to hover, I rushed to the door, flicking off the light as I went. My footsteps echoed in the empty hallway as I left, the sound almost swallowed by the thick, heavy silence that filled the building. Outside, the night air was cold and biting, but it felt like a release. I took deep breaths, trying to calm my racing heart. But as I walked toward my car, a lingering feeling told me that this was far from over. That office, that desk, whatever had happened in there was not finished with me yet. As soon as I got home, I locked the door behind me and let out a long, unsteady breath. The familiar surroundings brought some comfort, but the events of the evening kept replaying in my mind, each memory more unsettling than the last. I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd been in the presence of something dark, something that defied explanation. I sat down with my laptop, determined to find answers. Maybe knowing the history of the office building would help me understand what had just happened, or, at the very least, give me some sense of control over this situation. I began searching local archives, records, anything that might reveal something about the building's past. An hour slipped by as I combed through articles and scanned public records. Finally, a headline caught my eye: family refuses to sell land, home raised in tragic fire. I clicked on the article, my heart pounding as I read. Decades ago, a family had lived on the land where my office now stood. They had been one of the last holdouts in the area, refusing to sell their home to developers who were buying up land for commercial expansion. According to the article, tensions had risen between the family and the developers, who had made multiple offers, each one declined. The family had insisted on keeping their home, determined not to let their land be swallowed by the growing corporate presence. Then, one night, a fire swept through their home. The article was vague about the cause, mentioning only that it was under investigation. But neighbors had reported strange sounds and shadows near the property in the days leading up to the fire. In the end, the entire family perished, their home reduced to ashes. And just a year later, the office building was erected on that very spot. The words on the screen blurred as I felt a cold dread settle over me. Was it possible that the presence I'd felt in the office was somehow connected to this family? Had their spirits lingered, bound to the land they had refused to give up? I closed my laptop, but the image of the headline stayed with me, haunting me long after I'd turned off the lights. The more I thought about the story, the more unsettling it became. A family determined to keep their land. Developers pushing for progress at any cost. The fire, mysterious, unexplained, and yet somehow so final. But what troubled me most were the rumors I found buried deep in the archives, stories whispered by locals who remembered that time. I dug deeper into the history of the property, finding more pieces to the puzzle. The developers were known for getting what they wanted, no matter the cost. It wasn't just about buying land, it was about controlling everything. The family that had lived on the land was described as stubborn, fiercely protective of their home. The more I read, the clearer it became that their refusal to sell had not just angered the developers, it had enraged them. I found a few anonymous accounts from neighbors who had witnessed strange things in the days before the fire. One person claimed they saw shadowy figures moving around the house at night, even though no one had been living there for days. Another described hearing whispers, voices that seemed to come from nowhere, just beyond the reach of sight. But it wasn't until I stumbled upon an old police report that the true horror of the tragedy began to take shape. The fire, according to the report, had been declared an accident. However, there were discrepancies in the details. The fire had started in the middle of the night, but the fire department had reported seeing signs of forced entry into the house, something they had never fully investigated. Some of the family's belongings, including a few heirlooms, were never found. It was as if they had simply vanished, taken from the house before the flames even reached it. The most chilling part, however, was the final statement in the report: no survivors. Cause of death consistent with exposure to high levels of smoke and intense heat. No indication of foul play. No known witnesses. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was missing something crucial, something dark and hidden, tied to that family's refusal to sell. I started to wonder if their death had truly been an accident, or if someone had made sure they never left the house alive. And if so, why had they been targeted so ruthlessly? The connection to the office building now seemed undeniable. The spirits of the family, lost and vengeful, couldn't have moved on. Perhaps their souls were still tethered to the land, unwilling to let go of their home, their legacy. As I closed the laptop, my heart raced. I felt as though I were standing on the edge of something vast, something terrifying that I couldn't fully comprehend. I had to know more. But deep down, I feared that the closer I got to the truth, the more dangerous it would become. The next day, I returned to the office, the memories of the previous evening still fresh in my mind. But as soon as I walked through the doors, something felt off. The office, which had once seemed so ordinary, now felt different, heavier, somehow. The air felt thicker, as if the walls themselves were holding secrets, waiting to be revealed. I greeted my coworkers as I usually did, but their responses were colder than usual. A quick nod here, a distracted good morning there, nothing warm, nothing friendly. I couldn't put my finger on it at first, but there was a palpable shift in the atmosphere. It wasn't just that they were busy, they seemed to be avoiding eye contact, keeping their distance. I sat at my desk, trying to focus on the work in front of me, but I couldn't help but notice how the others acted. In the break room, several of my colleagues huddled in quiet, tense conversations, their voices low and hurried. They quickly fell silent when I entered, as though they'd been discussing something they didn't want me to hear. Even Sarah, the usually chatty HR manager, gave me a tight, forced smile before she turned away quickly, muttering something about having lots of work to do. The longer I watched, the more obvious it became something was wrong, and it was like they were all in on some unspoken truth, a truth they weren't willing to share. I couldn't understand it at first. Were they uncomfortable because of my late hours the previous night? Or was it something deeper? I decided to reach out to Dan, the office IT guy, hoping to break the silence. When I approached him, he was sitting at his desk, his eyes glued to the screen, his hands hovering over the keyboard as if frozen in thought. He glanced up when I spoke, but his gaze was distant, unfocused. He nodded vaguely, but I could tell he wasn't really listening. "You okay?" I asked, trying to sound casual. He nodded again, but there was a hesitation in his movement, as though he were weighing every word he spoke. His eyes darted nervously to the door, then back to me. "Yeah, fine," he said, his voice tight. But I noticed his hands were shaking slightly as he clicked the mouse. "Just lots on my plate." I frowned, sensing something wasn't right. I'd never seen Dan like this before. He was usually a calm, laid-back guy. Yet today, he seemed jumpy, on edge. There was a brief, uneasy silence between us before he muttered, "You should probably take it easy here. The place is different, you know?" I was about to ask him what he meant, but before I could, he quickly changed the subject, asking if I needed any help with IT. His sudden shift in topic only made me more suspicious. As the day went on, I began to notice more odd behaviors. People were constantly looking over their shoulders, eyes flicking nervously to the corners of the room. There was an unspoken tension in the air that no one seemed willing to acknowledge, but it was undeniable. It was like they all knew something I didn't, something that made them uneasy, and they were too afraid to talk about it. By the time the workday was over, I had a sinking feeling in my stomach. The atmosphere in the office had shifted, and the strange, inexplicable events that had happened to me seemed to be affecting the others too. Whatever was haunting this place, whatever was connected to the land and the family that had once lived here, it wasn't just me. It was affecting everyone. The following days dragged on in a haze of unease. I tried to push through the work, to focus on the tasks at hand, but no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't escape the feeling that something was always just behind me, lurking, waiting. At night, I still had trouble sleeping, tossing and turning in bed, haunted by the images of shadows and whispers. It didn't take long for the office to begin taking on a new, more sinister form. At first, it was small things. Out of the corner of my eye, I'd catch a flicker of movement down the hallway, like someone walking quickly around the corner, but when I looked, the corridor was always empty. One morning, as I passed the break room on my way to my desk, I caught sight of a shadow, just a shadow, moving along the wall. I froze, my heart skipping a beat, but when I turned around, the hallway was vacant. No one was there. The worst part was when I started seeing things in their reflections. One afternoon, I stood in front of the bathroom mirror, washing my hands. As I wiped my face, I saw it, just a flash, but unmistakable. A figure, standing just behind me, its outline distorted, its features impossible to make out. I whipped around, but the room was empty, the door still closed. The sensation that I was being watched, followed, only intensified. I couldn't escape it. Every surface, every window, every reflection seemed to hold something hidden. Each time I glanced into a mirror, I felt the cold weight of someone else's gaze, even though no one was there. At my desk, the feeling was just as oppressive. The computer screen flickered in a way I could never quite explain. Every so often, the letters seemed to scramble into strange shapes, like the machine was trying to form words that it shouldn't have known. But it was the reflection of the office itself, mirrored on the surface of the glass, that terrified me most. I kept seeing flashes of someone standing behind me, their face only half visible, their features darkened by the lack of light. The figure was always there, just out of my direct line of sight. I turned around quickly, but there was no one. Nothing but the empty desks and flickering lights. I tried to stay calm, to rationalize what I was experiencing. Maybe it was just exhaustion, maybe my mind was playing tricks on me. But deep down, I knew I wasn't imagining it. This was something real, something far beyond anything I could explain. Even the air in the office felt heavier now, filled with an oppressive sense of dread. Each creak of the building's old wooden floorboards echoed like footsteps. Each shift in the shadows seemed deliberate, like someone, or something, was waiting for me to notice. I couldn't escape the feeling that the place itself was alive with memories, with things that had happened long before I arrived. And those memories, those echoes, were coming back to haunt me. The more I tried to ignore them, the more insistent they became, clawing at my sanity, pulling me deeper into the darkness of the building's past. The figure in the reflections wasn't just a trick of the light, it was a warning, I realized. Whatever had happened here before, whatever had tied this place to the land, wasn't finished. And now, I was part of it. I was sitting at my desk, staring blankly at the screen, trying to focus on the mountain of work I had left. My hands were trembling, and every creak of the building seemed louder, more deliberate, like it was drawing closer. I couldn't shake the sense that something was watching me, something just out of reach, lurking in the corners of my vision. The air in the office felt thick with tension, as if the walls themselves were closing in. I had tried to tell myself it was just stress, just exhaustion from late nights, but deep down, I knew better. This place, the land, the history, it was doing something to me, something I couldn't explain. And then, as if to confirm my worst fears, it happened again. The computer in front of me flickered, the screen flashing briefly before going black. My breath caught in my throat as I quickly reached for the mouse, trying to wake it up. But when the screen returned, there it was, another message, the words stark and cold. You will not leave. I froze, staring at the screen, my heart pounding in my chest. A cold wave of dread washed over me. My fingers trembled as I hovered over the keyboard, unsure of what to do. I had to be dreaming. I had to be. But as I looked around, the office was eerily still, the silence more oppressive than ever. My breath grew shallow, my pulse quickening as panic clawed at the edges of my mind. I stood up, my chair scraping sharply against the floor, the sound seeming too loud in the quiet room. I glanced around the office again, hoping for some rational explanation, but there was nothing but the flickering lights above me and the empty desks that suddenly felt far too close. I grabbed my coat, my hands unsteady as I tried to leave, to escape this nightmare, but as I reached for the door, I stopped. There, just beyond the glass, I saw something. A shadow, no, a figure, standing motionless in the hallway. My breath caught in my throat. I couldn't see its face, but I could feel its presence, its weight pressing down on me, as if it were waiting for me to move. My body tensed, every instinct screaming at me to turn around and run. But I couldn't. The figure didn't move. I swallowed hard, my throat dry. I looked back at the computer, still displaying the chilling message, "You will not leave." A sickening thought crept into my mind. Was it trying to keep me here? To trap me, just like it had trapped the family all those years ago? The thought was maddening, but I couldn't dismiss it. My heart raced, and I fought to steady my breath, to calm the panic that threatened to overwhelm me. I reached for the door handle again, the cold metal biting into my palm, and I willed myself to open it. I didn't care if the figure in the hallway was real or some twisted product of my mind. I had to leave. But as the door creaked open, I heard it. The whisper, faint at first, like the rustling of old paper. And then it grew louder, more distinct, until I could almost hear the words. "You can't run." I froze, the blood draining from my face. The figure in the hallway stepped forward, its shape now becoming clearer, its presence undeniably real. It was not a trick of the light or my imagination. It was here. It was waiting. With every ounce of strength, I slammed the door shut behind me, my pulse hammering in my chest. There was no escape. Not now. Not from this place. And deep down, I knew I had been warned. The days after the chilling morning felt like a blur. I tried to convince myself that I was just exhausted, that the stress of moving to a new place and dealing with a new job was playing tricks on me. But deep down, I knew something far darker was at work. Something beyond the realm of explanation. It started small, subtle, almost imperceptible changes in the environment. I would walk into the office in the morning and find the doors to the supply room wide open, despite being sure they had been closed the night before. A cabinet in the back would be ajar, a drawer pulled out slightly, as if someone or something had been tampering with it. It was always small, insignificant things that might be easily brushed off. But the unease that crept into my mind with each passing day made it harder to ignore. But then, one afternoon, it escalated. I was working late again, the office dark and quiet, save for the soft hum of the air conditioning. My mind was foggy from hours of staring at the screen, but I couldn't bring myself to leave. There was something drawing me back to the office, something I couldn't explain. It was like a magnetic pull, an invisible force that made me feel like I had no choice but to stay. Suddenly, the lights flickered. At first, I thought it was just a glitch, but the flickering grew more persistent, like the building itself was struggling to keep the lights on. I glanced up, annoyed, but then something else caught my attention. The door to the break room, one I was sure had been closed just moments before, suddenly slammed shut. The force of the door rattled the frame, and I could hear the metal latch clicking as it locked itself. I froze, staring at it, my heart thudding in my chest. I hadn't heard anyone else come into the room. The building was empty. A chill ran down my spine. This wasn't normal. I stood up cautiously, my body tense as I approached the door. I reached out to try the handle, but before I could touch it, the unmistakable smell hit me, the scent of damp earth and decay, like moldy wood or wet stone. It was thick, musty, and seemed to hang in the air like a presence of its own. The stench was overpowering, making my stomach turn. I backed away, my mind racing. I had worked here for weeks, and I had never noticed anything like this before. But there was no denying it now. The air was thick with it, and I felt a deep unease gnawing at me, urging me to leave. But before I could make up my mind, the office door behind me slammed shut too. I whipped around, my heart racing, and saw it. The door was completely shut, the handle twisted in a way that suggested someone had forced it closed from the outside. My first instinct was to push against it, to force it open, but something stopped me. There was a feeling, a heaviness in the air that made me hesitate, like the building was holding me in. I placed my hand on the door handle, half expecting it to be cold, but instead, it burned under my touch, as though the metal had been heated to an unnatural temperature. I recoiled, startled by the sudden sensation, and that's when I heard it, footsteps. Soft, deliberate steps coming from the hallway. They were too even, too controlled to be anything natural. My breath hitched in my chest as I turned toward the sound, my eyes searching the hallway for any sign of movement. But there was nothing there. Just the dimly lit corridor stretching before me, empty and silent. The footsteps stopped. I stood there, my heart pounding in my chest, my eyes darting around, desperately searching for the source. But there was no one. Nothing. Then, from somewhere behind me, I felt it, a cold, clammy hand brush against the back of my neck. I spun around, my pulse racing, but again, there was nothing. No person. No shadow. Only the eerie stillness of the office, like the space itself had come alive with some unseen force. I backed away from the door, my breath shallow, my mind a whirlwind of confusion and terror. What was happening? What was trying to make contact with me? The air was thick with the smell of decay now, almost suffocating. I could feel the weight of it pressing down on me, like the walls were closing in. The door in front of me was still locked, the handle burning with unnatural heat. But it wasn't just the physical sensations, the footsteps, the cold touch, the smell, it was the feeling that I was no longer alone. The office, once a mundane place filled with nothing more than the sounds of keyboards and office chatter, had become something else entirely. It had become a prison. And something inside was watching, waiting for me to make my next move. I had to leave. But as I reached for the door again, I knew, deep down, that it wasn't going to be that easy. The tension in the office only grew worse in the days following my unnerving experience. The whispers were starting again, subtle at first, just the soft murmur of conversations that halted whenever I walked by. But it wasn't long before it became impossible to ignore. Something was wrong, and I could feel it in the way people avoided eye contact, in the way their voices dropped to hushed tones whenever I entered a room. I was still trying to make sense of everything, trying to rationalize the strange occurrences in the office, but every time I thought I had a handle on it, something new happened. Something worse. It began with one of the employees, a man named Tom, who worked in the same department as me. He was quiet, unassuming, the kind of person who could go unnoticed for days at a time. I had only exchanged a few words with him, but he seemed like a nice enough guy. He always arrived early and left late, and his desk was usually the first thing I saw when I walked into the office in the morning. But one day, Tom didn't show up. At first, I thought nothing of it. People miss work sometimes, especially with the stress of deadlines. But then, as the day went on, it became clear that something was off. His desk remained untouched, the chair still swiveling slightly as if he had just gotten up a moment ago. The computer screen was blank, the mouse still in the middle of a document he had been working on. No one seemed to know where he was, and when I asked around, the response was always the same: he hasn't come in today. That wasn't like Tom. He was always here. By noon, the rumors started. I overheard one of the senior managers talking quietly with a few other employees by the water cooler, their voices too low to make out the details. But the tone, there was something in it, something that didn't sit right. It was tense, urgent. Later that afternoon, I overheard another conversation in the break room. Someone was whispering about how they hadn't seen Tom leave the building the night before. It was a quiet remark, but the implication hit me like a punch to the gut. Had he left? I tried to focus on my work, but the unease that had been gnawing at me since my first strange experience was now a constant companion, scratching at the edges of my thoughts. The office felt colder, emptier. As if something was missing, and that something was Tom. By the end of the day, no one had heard from him. His phone went straight to voicemail. His email inbox sat untouched, no out-of-office replies. It was as if he had just vanished. I stayed late again that night, the silence in the office more oppressive than ever. The lights flickered intermittently, casting long shadows across the rows of empty desks. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, something had happened to Tom, something that had to do with this place. I tried to call him myself, but the call went unanswered, and for a brief moment, I considered going to his apartment to check on him. But then I remembered the last conversation we had, a passing comment, nothing unusual. He had mentioned working late the previous evening, just like I had. But after that, I couldn't recall any other details. As I sat at my desk, I heard the sound of footsteps behind me, soft, deliberate, like someone walking slowly through the rows of desks. I turned quickly, but the hallway was empty. No one was there. I felt a sudden cold wash over me, the temperature dropping sharply, as if the building itself were breathing. I couldn't stay here much longer, but something kept me rooted to the spot. The lights flickered again, and when they came back on, I saw something, just for a second. A shadow in the corner of my eye. I turned my head, but nothing was there. The door to the break room, which had been firmly shut when I arrived that evening, was now slightly ajar. I didn't remember hearing it open. And then it happened, the faint sound of a voice, just on the edge of hearing, as though it was coming from inside the walls. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable. A low murmur, almost like a chant, echoing through the emptiness of the office. I stood up abruptly, my chair scraping noisily against the floor. There was a sickening feeling in the pit of my stomach, the kind that comes when you realize you're no longer alone. I grabbed my coat and rushed toward the door, the hallway stretching out before me like an endless void. As I stepped outside the office building, I could see that the world hadn't changed. The streets were the same as they had always been, quiet, suburban, empty of anything unusual. But something had changed for me. Something in the air felt wrong, charged with an energy I couldn't explain. And as I walked to my car, the chilling thought crossed my mind, what if Tom hadn't just disappeared? What if he had become part of whatever was happening here? The rumors spread faster now. The next day, whispers echoed through the office about Tom's disappearance. Some said he had quit, others said he had taken a leave of absence. But I didn't believe them. I knew what I had felt, what I had seen. And I knew that whatever had claimed Tom was still here. Watching. Waiting. And I was next. The days after Tom's disappearance felt like an endless blur of unease. Every time I walked into the office, I was met with the same feeling of dread, the same suffocating air that seemed to hang heavy in the hallways. The building had never felt more oppressive, and despite my best efforts to push the fear aside, something always lingered in the back of my mind. The disappearance of Tom was just the beginning. I could feel it. Whatever had claimed him wasn't done yet. I couldn't stop myself from coming every day, though. Something kept pulling me back. Maybe it was my own stubbornness or perhaps the need to understand what was happening. But I knew deep down I couldn't leave. Not yet. One morning, as I walked into the office early, long before the others arrived, I noticed something strange. A small, dusty box had been left on the floor near my desk. It was an old wooden box, cracked at the corners, its surface worn with age. It was unusual, especially considering the office had been renovated recently. There was no reason for something like this to be lying around, especially not in the middle of the floor. Curiosity gnawed at me, and I knelt down to inspect it. The box was heavy, almost too heavy for its size. As I opened the lid, a wave of stale air hit me, like the box hadn't been touched in decades. Inside, there were old photographs, sepia-toned images of a family. The pictures were faded, the edges curled and torn with age, but the people in them were unmistakably real. There were 2 parents, a man and a woman, and 3 children, 2 girls and a boy, all of them looking happy in front of a small, white house. The house looked familiar. It was the one I had seen in the records, the one the previous family had lived in before they had been forced out by the developers. It had been torn down long ago, replaced by the office building where I worked. I dug deeper into the box, pulling out other items, an old, cracked porcelain doll with hollow eyes, a tattered lace handkerchief, and a small metal key. The key looked like it could belong to a drawer or a chest, something that had long been forgotten. A chill ran down my spine as I held it, the weight of the object oddly significant. It felt like a key to something I wasn't meant to find. I quickly shoved the items back into the box, feeling a growing sense of unease. What were these things doing here? Why had they been hidden? The sense of wrongness in the air deepened, and I couldn't shake the feeling that the presence in the office, whatever it was growing stronger. I hurriedly closed the box, but as I was about to put it back where I'd found it, I heard something. A faint noise, like a whisper. At first, I thought it was just my imagination, but then it came again, a soft, almost imperceptible sound that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. The whisper was muffled, unintelligible, but I could feel the words press against my skull, trying to make themselves heard. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. The air around me seemed to grow thicker, heavier. It was the same feeling I had had the night Tom disappeared, that suffocating presence that seemed to fill every corner of the office. I looked around nervously, my eyes scanning the room. The office was still, as if nothing had changed. But something was different. The faint scent of mildew lingered in the air, and I noticed for the first time that the office seemed older, darker, as though the walls themselves carried the weight of forgotten memories. Without thinking, I rushed to place the box back in its hiding spot. But as I turned, something caught my eye, an old photograph pinned to the wall. I hadn't noticed it before, but now it seemed to stand out like a beacon. The photograph was of the same family from the pictures in the box, the man, the woman, and the 3 children. But there was something wrong about it. The photo was dark, the edges frayed, and the faces of the children were blurred, as though someone or something had tried to erase them from the image. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. It wasn't just the photograph that disturbed me. It was the feeling, the unmistakable sensation that I was being watched. I glanced over my shoulder, but the office was empty, just the usual rows of desks, silent and still. Then the whisper came again. Closer this time, sharper. I could make out a few words. We never wanted to leave. The voice sent a shiver through me. I could feel the cold, icy fingers of fear wrap around my chest. What did it mean? Who was speaking? I backed away from the photograph, but as I did, I noticed something else, a small, handwritten note on the desk near the box. It was in the same faded ink, the same slanted handwriting as the note on the computer screen I had seen days before. "They'll take you too." The words were scrawled in a hasty, urgent script, as if someone had been trying to warn me. The thought of leaving rushed to the front of my mind, but I couldn't move. My feet felt glued to the floor, my body frozen in place. As I stared at the note, I heard something, louder this time. A distinct, echoing creak, like the sound of old wood under pressure. It was coming from behind me. I turned slowly, my stomach twisting in knots. The hallway outside my office was empty, but the noise, it was growing louder, and it wasn't coming from the walls anymore. No, it was coming from the old wooden box, now sitting innocently on the floor. I knew then, this was no accident. Whoever had placed these things here, whoever had hidden them away, had left them for a reason. And I was about to find out why. The events of the past few days had already begun to blur the line between reality and something far darker. The office, once a mundane place of work, had transformed into a place of lurking dread. I couldn't explain it away anymore. There was something in this building, something tied to the tragic past of the family that had once lived here. And every day, I felt myself drawn deeper into it. I had been trying to keep my focus on work, but the thoughts of the old photographs, the creepy box, and the disturbing whispers kept intruding. My sleep was fitful, my mind constantly racing. I couldn't shake the image of those blurred faces in the photograph, the faces of the children who had somehow been erased from the picture. It was as though they were trying to hide something, something they didn't want me to see. That afternoon, I decided to take a break and clear my head. The air in the office felt suffocating, and I needed some space, just a moment to breathe without the constant weight of fear pressing on me. I walked down the hallway to the break room, and as I passed a row of desks, I noticed something odd in the reflection of the glass door. It was my own face, staring back at me, but there was something wrong with it, something I couldn't place. I stopped in my tracks, my heart pounding in my chest. I stared at my reflection, and for a split second, I thought I saw someone else in the glass. A face, pale and distorted, pressed close to the glass from behind me. It wasn't a colleague, no, it was a face I didn't recognize. It was a woman, her features soft but strained, as though she were trapped in the reflection, struggling to break free. My breath caught in my throat. I turned quickly, but the hallway was empty. I glanced back at the door, only to find the reflection was now mine alone. I shook my head, telling myself it was just a trick of the light, a fleeting moment of paranoia. But as I turned to walk toward the break room, I caught something that made my blood run cold. The photograph I had seen earlier, the one of the family, was now hanging crookedly on the wall of the break room. The frame had shifted slightly, as if it had been moved. I hadn't touched it. In fact, I was certain no one else had either. I approached it slowly, feeling the weight of the moment. The photo, still faded and old, showed the family standing together in front of the White House, their smiles genuine, their eyes bright. But it wasn't the picture that held my attention now, it was the face of the woman in the photograph. It looked different, as though something had changed in the image. The woman's eyes, those wide, hollow eyes, now seemed to stare at me, her expression no longer smiling. It was almost as if she knew I was there, as if she was watching me, pleading for something. I reached out and touched the frame, the glass cool against my fingertips. My own reflection was there too, faintly visible in the glass. But as I looked closer, I saw something else. Something in the corner of the photo, something that hadn't been there before. The faint outline of a shadow hovering just behind the family. It was blurry, indistinct, but it was there, unnerving, as if it was trying to break through the image to make itself known. I blinked, and when I looked again, the shadow was gone. But then I felt it, something cold and clammy brushing against my neck, as if a hand had just passed over my skin. I spun around, heart racing, but the room was empty. I stumbled backward, shaking. My mind was scrambling to find a logical explanation, to tell myself that it was nothing. But deep down, I knew it wasn't nothing. I had felt it, the cold, the presence, the unmistakable sense of being watched. I rushed out of the break room, my mind whirling. I needed to get out, to leave, but I couldn't. Not yet. I had to understand what was happening here. I walked back to my desk, my steps hurried, my pulse thumping in my ears. When I sat down, I glanced over at the old photograph again, the one I had hidden in my drawer. The faces in the photos seemed so much clearer now, too clear, almost as if they were looking directly at me. The woman's face, the one I had seen in the reflection, was still there. But now, it wasn't just her face I was seeing. It was the face of the girl, the one who had been in the corner of the photograph, the one who had been erased. Her face, ghostly and pale, stared back at me, her eyes wide with fear. And then, for the first time, I realized what it meant. The woman in the photo, she wasn't just a figure from the past. She was still here, trapped in the walls of this office, just like the others. She had never left. She was watching me. And I was beginning to understand that she wasn't the only one. I couldn't ignore it anymore. The whispers, the cold presence, the haunting photographs, it was all too much. I had tried to rationalize it, tell myself that it was just my mind playing tricks on me, but I couldn't deny it any longer. Something was terribly wrong in this office, and I was in the middle of it. I had tried to keep my distance, to ignore the eerie signs, but every day felt like I was stepping deeper into a trap I couldn't escape. The shadowy figures, the chilling whispers, the sudden cold air, nothing felt real anymore. It was as if the office itself had become a living entity, feeding off my fear, growing stronger with every passing moment. I knew I needed help. I couldn't do this alone. Whatever was here, whatever had been haunting this place, wasn't something I could handle on my own. That night, as I sat at my desk in the dim glow of the computer screen, I picked up my phone and made a call. The voice on the other end was calm, professional, but with a hint of concern when I explained what had been happening. I told the person everything, the whispers, the coldness, the photographs. I told them about the family, about the tragedy, about the feeling that something in the building was still alive, still watching. "I'm sorry you've been going through this," the voice said, after a long pause. "But you're not the first to experience something like this in that building. It's not just the history of the place, it's the land itself." The words sent a shiver down my spine. It wasn't just the building. It was the land. The family that lived there, the voice continued, they weren't just trying to protect their land from the developers. They were trying to protect something more. Something dark. And now, their spirits, their souls, are trapped. I felt a lump in my throat. "What do you mean trapped?" I asked, barely able to speak. "There's a curse," the voice explained, "on that land. It wasn't just the builders who caused the family's death. There are forces at play here that have been tied to that place for generations. When they died, their souls were bound to the land, unable to rest. And now, they're reaching out to those who come near, trying to drag them into their suffering. My chest tightened, and I could hardly breathe. This was worse than I'd imagined. It wasn't just a haunting. It was something far darker, something that had been festering for years, waiting for the right moment to strike. "But can you help me?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. The line was silent for a moment. "We can help," the voice finally said. "But it's not easy. It will take time, and it will require more than just one person. We need to perform a ritual, a cleansing of the land. You will need to be present, but you won't be able to do it alone." I nodded, though the person on the other end couldn't see me. I felt a flicker of hope, but it was quickly overshadowed by the weight of the situation. This wasn't going to be simple. It wasn't going to be something that could be fixed with a few prayers or a chant. This would take everything I had, and it would involve more than just confronting the spirits. It would mean confronting whatever had bound them to that place in the first place. "I'll do whatever it takes," I said, my voice steady despite the fear still churning in my gut. "Good," the voice replied. "But be warned, when we perform the cleansing, the spirits will be angered. They won't go easily. You need to prepare yourself for what's to come." The call ended with the faint sound of a sigh, and I sat in silence, the weight of the words sinking in. My mind raced as I tried to process everything I had just learned. The curse, the spirits, the ritual, all of it seemed so surreal, like something out of a nightmare. But the longer I stayed in this office, the more I realized that this wasn't a nightmare. This was real. And if I didn't do something about it, it was only going to get worse. I knew I had to go through with it. There was no turning back now. The spirits, those trapped souls, those lost and angry souls, were going to keep tormenting me until I found a way to free them. And I wasn't sure if I could survive it alone. The call had given me a sliver of hope, but also an overwhelming sense of dread. I wasn't just fighting for my own safety anymore. I was fighting for the peace of the souls that had been lost, the souls that had been trapped for far too long. And I was starting to realize that the more I learned, the less control I had. All I knew was that I had to do this. And I had to do it fast. Because whatever had been waking up in the office, whatever was still lurking in the shadows, wasn't going to wait forever. The night after my conversation with the mysterious voice on the phone was restless. I barely slept, tossing and turning, haunted by the images of the spirits in the photographs, the shadowy figures in the office, and the chilling whispers that seemed to echo through my mind. Every creak in the walls felt like a reminder that something was watching me, waiting for me to slip up. The thought that the curse wasn't just tied to the building, but to the very land itself, weighed heavily on my chest. The more I thought about it, the more I realized how little I actually knew about what I was dealing with. A ritual to free the spirits? A cleansing of the land? It all sounded like something out of a horror movie, but the fear in the voice on the phone had been real, too real to ignore. I couldn't shake the feeling that if I didn't act soon, the haunting would only escalate. My own sanity was beginning to unravel under the pressure, and I needed answers. I needed a way out. I had never been one to believe in the supernatural, but after everything I'd witnessed, there was no denying it anymore. I had no choice but to find someone who could guide me through the darkness, someone who had experience dealing with forces far beyond my understanding. The next morning, after what felt like hours of pacing in my apartment, I decided to take action. I found an old address online, an exorcist, or, as they called themselves, a spiritual medium who specialized in cases like mine. The website wasn't much to look at, just a simple page with vague details and a phone number. But I was desperate. I dialed the number, my hands trembling as I held the phone to my ear. A soft voice answered on the other end. Yes? The woman's voice was calm, almost soothing, but there was something about it that set me on edge. It was as if she already knew why I was calling. I need help, I stammered, the words coming out in a rush. There's something wrong. At my office. I think it's haunted. I need someone to help me get rid of the spirits. The ghosts. I don't know how to explain it, but I can't ignore it anymore. The woman was silent for a moment, and I could feel her evaluating me, as if she were weighing my sincerity. Then she spoke again, her voice quieter this time, almost as though she were speaking to herself. You've seen them, haven't you? The spirits. You can feel their presence. It's not just in the building, it's in the land. I froze. How do you know that? I've felt it before. Many times, she replied. The land you speak of is cursed. It's been bound by the anger and pain of those who died there. You cannot simply get rid of it with prayers or rituals alone. It's deeper than that. I swallowed hard, trying to steady my racing heart. What do you mean by that? What do I have to do? She took a deep breath before speaking again, as if choosing her words carefully. There is a way, but it's not easy. It's going to take more than just one person. And you have to be prepared to face the full extent of what's been unleashed. There is no simple solution, and if you're not careful, you may become part of the curse yourself. I felt a cold chill run down my spine, and the room seemed to grow darker. What do you mean, part of the curse? She hesitated, and I could sense her hesitation through the phone. The spirits, they aren't just looking for peace. They want to drag anyone near them into their pain. If you don't confront the source of their anger, you could become trapped with them, just as they were. I sank into the chair next to me, suddenly feeling the weight of the situation. The woman was right. This wasn't just about getting rid of the ghosts. It was about confronting whatever was causing their pain, whatever had tethered them to this place for so long. I don't know if I can do this alone, I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. What do I need to do? The woman's voice softened. You'll need to gather a group. People who understand this world, who know how to confront and communicate with the spirits. You cannot face this alone. But I can help guide you. I closed my eyes, absorbing her words. The thought of facing these spirits, these trapped souls, was terrifying. But I had no choice. I was already too deep into this, too tangled in the web of fear and anger that surrounded the land. If I didn't act, I would lose myself to it, just like the others who had come before me. All right, I said, my voice steady despite the fear clawing at my insides. I'll gather the people I need. How do I start? You need to meet me in person, the woman replied. There are things I need to show you. And you'll need to understand the history of the land, the curse that binds these souls. Only then can we begin the process of freeing them. She gave me an address, a secluded place just outside the town. As I hung up the phone, I felt a strange sense of relief, mixed with a growing sense of dread. The truth was, I didn't know what I was getting into. I didn't know if this woman could really help, or if I was just walking deeper into the nightmare. But I had no other choice. I had to take this step, to seek the answers, or the spirits would never leave me. I couldn't live like this anymore. I packed my things, made a quick stop for supplies, and drove out to the address the woman had given me. My heart raced as I navigated the winding roads, the trees casting long, shadowy shapes across the path. Every turn seemed to take me further away from the world I knew, into something darker, more dangerous. When I finally arrived, the house was exactly what I had expected, old, isolated, and steeped in an unsettling quiet. The windows were dark, and the air around the place felt thick, heavy, like it had been waiting for me. I knocked on the door, unsure of what I would find on the other side. But when the door creaked open, I knew I was about to learn far more than I was ready for. And as I stepped inside, I felt the weight of the curse press down on me once more. I stepped into the dimly lit room, my senses immediately assaulted by the smell of incense and the faint hum of an unseen energy in the air. The woman, who introduced herself as Livia, motioned for me to sit, her face calm yet carrying an air of knowing that sent an uncomfortable chill through my bones. Her house, an old farmhouse nestled on the outskirts of town, felt out of place, as if it existed in a different time, away from the modern world. Livia didn't waste any time. She went straight to the point, her voice steady but filled with a seriousness that left no room for doubt. "The land you speak of," she began, "is cursed, yes. But what you don't know is that it's not just the spirits of the family who died there that linger. The land itself carries the remnants of an ancient power, twisted by the violence that took place." Her eyes fixed on me as if weighing every word. "This isn't just a haunting, it's a battle between forces older than you can imagine. And you, young man, are caught in the middle of it." I shifted uncomfortably in my seat, but said nothing, waiting for her to explain further. "You've heard of the family that once lived on that land, the ones who refused to sell," Livia continued. "But their story goes deeper than simple defiance. The house was built on land that was once sacred, a place of power long before the first settlers arrived. It was never meant to be disturbed. And when they tried to tear it down, when they tried to take what didn't belong to them, the curse was set in motion." I leaned forward, suddenly feeling the weight of her words pressing down on me. What exactly happened? How did they die? Livia sighed and turned her gaze to the wall, where a large map of the area hung. She traced her finger across it, stopping at a spot marked with a faded red circle. The family that lived there, John and Sarah Riles, their children, were killed, yes. But it wasn't just a simple murder. The land fought back. The spirits of those who had lived and died here long before them, the ones tied to the power of the land, became enraged. And in their rage, they made sure the family would never leave. They died in ways that defy reason, disappearances, illnesses, violent accidents. But before they perished, they knew their time was coming. They buried part of their house, part of their foundation, somewhere on the land. Somewhere no one should find it. My throat felt dry. "What do you mean? Why would they bury their own house?" "Because, child," she replied softly, "they knew what would happen if the house was destroyed completely. The spirits would be free to wreak havoc on anyone who came after. The family hid the foundation, hoping that it would keep the land's curse contained. But the construction project continued anyway. And now, the spirits are restless. They know you're here. They know what's happening." I was trying to digest what she was saying, but the weight of the information felt too much to handle. "So, what exactly am I supposed to do? How do I stop this?" Livia stood and motioned for me to follow her. She led me through a narrow hallway and into a back room where a heavy stone altar sat, surrounded by books and old artifacts. On one of the shelves, I noticed several items that appeared to be relics, worn down by time but still holding some kind of power. At the center of the altar, there was a map of the land around the office building, marked with strange symbols. She pointed to a spot on the map. This is where they buried part of the foundation. You must go there, find the remnants of the house, and perform a ritual to release the spirits. But be warned, this isn't a task for the faint of heart. The curse is not something you can just undo with a simple chant. You will need to confront the anger of the spirits, face their wrath, and somehow find a way to bind them to rest. My mind raced, struggling to catch up with what she was saying. Where exactly is this place? How do I get there? Lydia hesitated before answering, her gaze turning grim. The spot is hidden beneath the ruins of the house, but it's not easy to find. The land has shifted, changed over the years. The foundation, the burial site, it's buried under layers of earth and time. You'll need to follow the signs. Look for the old oak tree near the east side of the property, just beyond the parking lot of the office. Beneath it, you'll find a hidden entrance. I felt my stomach churn. An entrance to what? To the forgotten place where the foundation rests, she said. Once you find it, the ritual can begin. But beware, you won't be alone there. The spirits will try to stop you. They will try to draw you into their rage. If you're not careful, you'll never leave that place. And neither will the souls trapped there. I stood there, speechless, overwhelmed by the enormity of what she was asking me to do. But somewhere deep inside, I knew there was no turning back. I had already seen too much, felt too much, to pretend this was all just a bad dream. I'll do it, I said, my voice sounding stronger than I felt. I'll find this spot. I'll face the spirits. Lydia nodded slowly, her expression unreadable. Then go. Time is running out, and the longer you wait, the harder it will be to break the curse. I turned and walked out of the room, my heart pounding with each step. The map in my mind was clear now. I had to go back to the office, to the very place where it all began, and find that hidden spot beneath the earth. Only then would I know if the curse could be broken, or if I was already too late. The road ahead was uncertain, and the danger was real. But there was no other choice. I had to find the foundation, perform the ritual, and confront whatever was waiting in the dark corners of the land. Because if I didn't, I knew the spirits would come for me, and they would never let me go. As I left Lydia's house, the weight of what she had shared with me hung heavy on my shoulders. The land was cursed, the spirits restless, and the only hope for survival lay in uncovering the foundation of the long-lost house. But there was something more she hadn't said, something that lingered between the lines. I could feel it, an underlying tension, an unspoken warning. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being led down a dangerous path, one from which there might be no return. As the days went by, I couldn't stop thinking about what she'd said, the ritual, the spirits, the hidden burial site, but most of all, her last words before I left her house. Remember, she had warned, her eyes piercing through me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. There is a way to free them, yes, but it will come at a cost. The land does not give up its dead easily. You'll have to face more than just the spirits of the family. There are forces older than them, forces that will try to stop you. And they won't hesitate to take everything from you if you fail. Her voice echoed in my mind as I drove back to the office that day, the road ahead stretching out like an endless expanse of uncertainty. The ominous warning weighed on me, gnawing at my resolve. I knew I had to go through with it. There was no turning back now, but the thought of what I might have to sacrifice in order to save those trapped souls terrified me. That night, I couldn't sleep. The images of the house, the land, and the spirits haunted my thoughts, twisting and turning in my mind like a never-ending nightmare. I found myself pacing the apartment, glancing at the clock every few minutes, waiting for something, anything, to give me a sense of direction, to let me know I was doing the right thing. Suddenly, there was a knock at the door. My heart skipped a beat as I froze. Who could it be at this hour? I hesitated for a moment, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. But then, I opened the door. To my surprise, it wasn't anyone I knew. Standing in the doorway was a man, tall, with sharp features and a gaze that seemed to pierce right through me. His face was solemn, his expression unreadable. "I was told you'd be here," he said, his voice low and calm. "I'm Marcus. I've been following your situation." I stepped back, both intrigued and uneasy. "How do you know about me?" I asked, my voice faltering slightly. "I've been watching," he replied cryptically. "Watching the land, watching you. I know what you're facing, and I'm here to help." I wasn't sure what to make of this stranger, but something about him made me feel like I didn't have much of a choice. "Help?" I asked, skeptical. "How can you help?" "I've already been to see Livia, and she gave me a lead, but I don't know if I can trust her advice. The land, it's cursed. The spirits, they..." Marcus raised a hand, cutting me off. "I know," he said, his voice calm yet firm. "And I know how it feels to be trapped in this kind of situation. But you're not alone. There are others like you, others who've tried to uncover the truth about that land." My heart raced as I realized he wasn't just some random stranger. There was something about him, a depth to his knowledge that felt unsettling. He wasn't just here by chance. "I've been studying the curse for years," he continued. "And I can tell you this much, the ritual you're planning to perform, it's not as straightforward as Livia believes. The spirits you seek to free are not the only ones you'll encounter. There are others who've been bound to that land, others who have been waiting." I swallowed hard, my throat dry. "Waiting? Waiting for what?" "For someone like you," he replied. "Someone who will dare to face what no one else can. The ritual, yes, it may free the spirits of the family. But it's also going to awaken something else, something far darker. It's why no one has succeeded before. They never accounted for the cost of the ritual." The dread I had been trying to push aside surged back into my chest, making my heart race. "What cost?" Marcus stepped closer, his eyes fixed on mine, his gaze intense. "The cost is not just your life. It's your very soul. The ritual will demand a sacrifice, something you won't be able to recover from. And if you're not careful, the forces that control that land will take it all. You'll be lost to the curse forever." His words struck me like a physical blow. I took a step back, my mind spinning. The realization hit me harder than I had expected. Even if I performed the ritual, there was no guarantee that I would survive, or that the spirits would be freed. And then Marcus's next words were like a cold hand on my spine. "But," he said slowly, "there's a way to escape the curse without paying the ultimate price. It's just dangerous." My pulse quickened. "What do you mean?" "You have to be willing to face the darkest part of yourself," he said quietly. "Only then can you break the curse without losing everything. But if you choose the wrong path, there will be no going back." I stood there, frozen, as the weight of his words sank in. My mind raced with questions, with doubts. What path was he talking about? Was there even a way out of this nightmare without sacrificing my soul? The answers weren't clear, and the fear gnawing at my insides only grew stronger. But one thing was certain, time was running out, and the only way to stop the curse was to continue forward into the unknown. Marcus turned to leave, his final words hanging in the air like an ominous warning. Remember, the land doesn't give up its dead easily. And neither will it release you without a price. The day had arrived. I couldn't put it off any longer. The sense of dread that had been growing inside me for weeks was now a tangible weight, pulling me down with each passing minute. I had no other choice but to go through with the ritual, to confront whatever lay hidden beneath the cursed land, and hope, pray, that the spirits could finally be freed. But the fear of what might happen, of what I might have to sacrifice, loomed over me like a shadow. I hadn't told anyone what I was planning. Not the colleagues who had grown distant, not even Livia. I couldn't risk anyone finding out. The less people knew, the better. I had seen enough of what this land could do to those who ventured too close, and I wasn't going to give the spirits or whatever force was controlling them any more power than they already had. I had spent the last few days gathering what I needed, strange symbols, items that were said to hold power in rituals, and even some personal effects of the dead family members. I wasn't sure which of these things would be required for the ritual, but I knew I couldn't afford to leave anything to chance. The office was eerily quiet that night, almost as though the building itself was aware of what was about to happen. My heart pounded in my chest as I moved through the familiar corridors, setting up the ritual space in a hidden corner of the office, away from the eyes of anyone who might walk in. I had chosen this spot for a reason. The old, worn desk I had been assigned to sat in the corner of the room, facing the wall, as though it had always been meant to be the center of something dark. The shadows seemed to stretch longer here, the air heavier. I could almost hear the faint hum of something unseen, pressing on me, reminding me that I was not alone. I began by carefully placing the symbols around the desk, using chalk and candles, whispering quiet incantations under my breath. Each movement felt rehearsed, yet my hands shook as I worked. Despite all the research, despite the warnings, there was something deeply unsettling about the process. The fear that had been slowly building up in me now felt like a physical presence, tugging at my every thought, my every breath. I had to do this. There was no turning back. As I arranged the last of the items on the desk, I felt a sudden chill sweep through the room. I froze, my fingers hovering over the final candle. Something was wrong. The cold intensified, and for a moment, I thought I heard a soft voice, like a whisper carried on the wind. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone sent a shiver down my spine. The building groaned around me, as if the walls themselves were alive, aware of the ritual I was about to begin. I looked around the office, but nothing seemed out of place. No one else was there. And yet, the feeling of being watched, of being surrounded by something unseen, had never been more suffocating. I lit the candles, one by one, each flame flickering wildly, casting long shadows on the walls. The room seemed to grow darker as the flames burned brighter, the light warping and bending unnaturally. I swallowed hard, my throat dry as I forced myself to focus. I had done this before in my mind, read about it in books, spoken with experts who had offered cryptic advice. But none of it had prepared me for the reality of what I was about to do. I wasn't just calling out to spirits, I was challenging something far more ancient and dangerous. The moment the final candle flickered to life, the temperature dropped again. The air felt thick, heavy, as though it was pressing in on me from all sides. I hesitated for a moment, staring at the symbols I had drawn, at the eerie glow of the candles that seemed to pulse with life. My heart was racing now, my palms slick with sweat. I had to speak the words, the incantations that would bring the spirits forth, but something stopped me. A voice, barely audible, echoed in my mind. It was the same voice I had heard in the darkness before, the one that had whispered through the office as if it had been there all along. "Do you know what you're doing?" I recoiled, almost dropping the matchstick I was holding. My breath caught in my throat. The voice was clear now, louder, more urgent. It felt as though the words were coming from somewhere within the walls, or even from the ground beneath me. I knew then that I had crossed a line. I wasn't just summoning the spirits of the family, I was waking something far more powerful. The ritual would not only disturb the restless souls, it would awaken the full force of the curse that had lingered here for so long. I steadied myself, trying to ignore the voice, the whispers that had started to grow louder, more desperate. There was no turning back now. I couldn't allow myself to show fear. Not now, not while I was so close. I spoke the words aloud, the incantation I had learned, hoping that it would be enough to free the spirits. My voice trembled at first, but I forced it steady as I spoke louder, more forcefully, with the full power of my will. The room seemed to hold its breath as I finished the final words. The candles flickered violently, and for a brief moment, the office plunged into darkness. Then, as the lights flickered back on, I saw it, a figure standing in the doorway, a shadow that hadn't been there before. I froze, my heart stopping in my chest. "It's too late now," the voice echoed again, but this time it was not just in my mind. It was coming from the figure in the doorway, whose face I couldn't make out, but whose presence was unmistakable. The ritual had awakened something, and now there was no turning back. The room seemed to close in on me. My breath became shallow, and I could feel the ground beneath me begin to tremble. Something was coming. Something I could not stop. And I had just unleashed it. The air in the office had become thick and oppressive, almost suffocating. The flickering of the candles cast strange, distorted shadows on the walls, but it was the presence in the doorway that held my attention, my heart pounding in my chest. The figure stood there, still and silent, like a specter born of the very darkness that had consumed the room. I could feel its gaze upon me, though its face remained hidden in the dim light. My breath caught in my throat, and I could barely move, paralyzed by an overwhelming sense of dread. The figure didn't speak at first, but I could feel its intent. The weight of its presence pressed in on me, and I realized, with growing terror, that this wasn't just a ghost, it was something far more powerful. Something that didn't want me here. The temperature in the room dropped further, a biting cold that reached into my bones. My teeth chattered uncontrollably as the figure stepped closer, its movement unnervingly slow, as though it was savoring my fear. Then, it spoke. The voice was not what I had expected. It wasn't a whisper or an echo from the past. It was cold, harsh, like the sound of broken glass scraping against stone. "Leave, now!" The words pierced through me like an icy wind. I tried to speak, to demand answers, to ask what it wanted, but no sound came from my mouth. My body refused to cooperate, locked in place by the fear that had rooted itself deep within me. The figure took another step forward, and I could feel the pressure in the room increase, like the walls were closing in. I wanted to run, to escape, but my feet were glued to the floor. "You don't belong here," it continued, its voice growing louder, more insistent. "This place is cursed, and so are you. Leave before it's too late." A chill ran down my spine. I didn't understand what it meant by cursed, but I could feel the truth of its words in the pit of my stomach. The ritual had disturbed something far beyond my control. The very air seemed to vibrate with the force of its presence, and I knew, deep down, that it wasn't just the spirit of the family who had died here, it was something darker, something tied to the land itself. I wanted to ask more, to beg for answers, but the ghost's presence was suffocating. The longer it stood there, the harder it became to breathe. It was as if the very essence of the office had become one with the apparition, and all I could hear was the rhythmic pounding of my own heart. Leave, or face the consequences, it warned, its voice like the scraping of nails on a chalkboard. The words were clear, final. I could feel the weight of its threat, and it was clear that it wasn't just a warning, it was a demand. The room seemed to pulse with an energy I couldn't comprehend, and I knew that whatever was happening, whatever had been unleashed, was far beyond anything I could handle. But the question gnawed at me: if I left, would I be safe? Or was it already too late? In a panic, I finally found my voice, whispering through my clenched teeth, "What do you want from me? Why are you here?" The figure didn't answer. Instead, it stepped forward again, now close enough that I could feel the cold radiating from it. My heart raced in my chest, and my mind screamed at me to run, but my body refused to obey. Then, I saw something in its shadow, a glimpse of something I hadn't noticed before. Faint, like an afterimage, there were shapes moving behind the ghost. Faces. The faces of the family who had once lived here, twisted in agony. The ghost reached out a hand, its fingers elongated and skeletal, pointing directly at me. Its touch, if it could even be called that, felt like ice, like the touch of death itself. "Leave," it repeated one final time, its voice a roar that shook the walls. "Or you will never leave. You will be one of us." I finally managed to break free from the paralysis, stumbling back, my legs barely able to support me. The figure didn't follow. It simply stood there, its eyes, if it even had eyes, fixed on me. The air crackled with energy, and I realized that every inch of the building was watching, waiting for my next move. With a final, shuddering breath, I ran. I didn't care about the ritual anymore, didn't care about anything but getting out. My feet flew across the cold, empty hallways, my mind spinning with the echo of the ghost's voice and the promise it had made. But even as I reached the door, I knew deep down that leaving wouldn't be enough. The curse had already taken hold. And now, there was no escape. The air felt suffocating as I stepped into the office that evening. The office, once just a place of work, had become a battleground between me and the unseen forces that now haunted it. Tonight was supposed to be the night I ended it, but with every step I took inside, my heart pounded harder, the weight of what was coming pressing down on me. I had made up my mind. I would face whatever haunted this place. I had no other choice. The ghosts were relentless. Their whispers, their shadows, their warnings, they wouldn't stop until they had me. I could feel it in the pit of my stomach, a gnawing sensation that had grown since I first encountered the malevolent force here. And the warnings had only intensified. Tonight, I was going to finish the ritual and free whatever spirits remained trapped in this cursed office. But part of me feared that in doing so, I would only make things worse. Still, there was no turning back. The ritual had been prepared, the candles were laid out, and everything was set up as instructed by the eccentric medium I had met earlier. The office was eerily quiet, save for the soft hum of the air conditioning and the distant sounds of cars driving by outside. The fluorescent lights flickered overhead, their buzzing only adding to the sense of unease that filled the room. The shadows in the corners seemed to stretch longer than usual, like dark fingers reaching out to claim the space. I moved quickly to my desk, where I had set up everything. The air was thick with tension, each breath feeling heavier than the last. I knew this wasn't just about getting rid of the spirits, it was about surviving the night. As I lit the final candle, I glanced around the room. The soft glow of the flames barely illuminated the space, casting everything into an eerie, dim light. The room felt smaller now, as if the walls were closing in. I could feel the chill in the air, more pronounced than before, as though something was lurking just beyond the flickering light, waiting to strike. The whispers started again. They were faint at first, barely audible, like the rustle of paper or the wind outside. But then they grew louder, more insistent. I could hear them clearly now, the voices of the spirits who had been wronged, trapped in this place. Their anger, their sorrow, their desperation, it all echoed through the room, filling the air with an oppressive weight. I took a deep breath and tried to steady myself. The ritual had to be completed. I had to free them. But just as I began to chant the words, a cold hand pressed against my shoulder. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. My body refused to move as I felt the fingers, cold as death, linger on my skin. I turned slowly, my heart racing, and found myself staring into empty space. There was no one behind me. Yet I knew, with every fiber of my being, that I was no longer alone. The presence had become tangible, its malevolent energy seeping into every corner of the room, surrounding me. I heard the voice again. This time, it wasn't a whisper. It was a low, guttural growl that seemed to come from the very walls. You cannot save them. You cannot save yourself. I felt a wave of panic rise up within me, threatening to choke me. My hands trembled, my mind spinning with the fear that had taken over me. What had I gotten myself into? The ritual, had it been enough? Was I truly prepared for what was coming? Then, the door slammed shut with such force that it rattled the windows. The lights flickered, and the temperature dropped even further. The shadows around me deepened, shifting as if they were alive. The whispers turned to screams, echoing in my mind, and I could feel my vision blur with the overwhelming sensation of dread. You cannot leave. You are ours now. The room seemed to close in on me. I tried to reach for the door, but my body moved like it was in slow motion. I stumbled, my legs heavy as though I were walking through mud. The ritual was supposed to protect me, but instead, it felt like I had summoned something far worse. Suddenly, the candles extinguished. The room plunged into complete darkness, and I could hear nothing but the frantic beating of my heart in my ears. I tried to steady my breath, my thoughts spiraling into chaos. Then, a figure emerged from the darkness. It was tall and thin, its face a blur of shadows. I couldn't make out any features, but I could feel its gaze upon me, cold, predatory. I stepped back, but my body didn't obey. It was as if I were frozen in place. The figure raised a hand, and with it, the temperature in the room plummeted. I could see my breath misting in the air, and the shadows seemed to twist and grow, stretching across the room, enveloping me. You will stay with us, it whispered, its voice filling my mind. You are already one of us. I could no longer hear the whispers of the spirits that had once begged for release. Instead, I heard only the silence of the dead, the heavy stillness that pressed in from all sides. I knew, in that moment, that the office was never going to let me go. The room seemed to close in on me, the shadows stretching and shifting with every flicker of candlelight. My breath was shallow, my chest tight with dread. I could feel the temperature drop, the air thick with an otherworldly chill that seemed to cling to my skin like ice. As I chanted the ancient words, the weight of the office around me grew heavier, pressing down, squeezing the air from my lungs. The shadows, once distant and vague, now crept toward me. They moved with purpose, as if they were alive, their dark forms slithering across the floor and walls like sentient creatures. The edges of the room blurred, the walls seeming to pulse and breathe as the very foundation of the building groaned under some invisible force. Suddenly, the quiet of the office shattered. A low, guttural sound, like the scraping of metal on stone, echoed through the room. It started faintly but grew louder, coming from every direction until it felt as if the walls themselves were speaking. The sound twisted in my ears, making my teeth ache with the pressure. The temperature continued to plummet, the cold sinking deeper into my bones. The flickering candles seemed to cast longer, more grotesque shadows, as if they too were being manipulated by something unseen. I could see them in the corners of my vision, figures, vague at first, but becoming clearer with each passing second. There were faces now, emerging from the shadows, their eyes wide and unblinking, mouths open in silent screams. The faces of those who had been wronged. I couldn't focus. The chant was becoming harder to remember, my voice trembling as I tried to hold onto the words. The floor beneath me felt unstable, as if it too were shifting, trying to pull me down into the darkness that now filled the room. Then, I heard it, a whisper, but it wasn't the usual faint, distant voice I had grown used to. No, this was different. It was loud, urgent, close. You should not have come. The whisper echoed in my mind, wrapping around my thoughts, pushing them into dark corners. I clenched my eyes shut, trying to ignore it, to push it out. But the pressure grew stronger. I could feel something pulling at me, tugging at my very soul. The shadows were no longer just shadows, they were reaching for me, their tendrils inching closer with every breath I took. I could feel them brushing against my legs, my arms, their cold fingers seeping through my skin. I stumbled backward, my body moving of its own accord, as though trying to escape the force that was slowly suffocating the room. The walls seemed to pulse again, and then, without warning, the lights went out completely. I was plunged into darkness. In the void, the shadows grew bolder, filling the space where light once was. The whispers became a chorus, their words no longer whispers, but loud, demanding shouts. You cannot stop it, they screamed in unison. This is where you belong. I could feel the presence behind me, something, or someone, moving closer, its breath hot against my neck. I turned quickly, but there was nothing there. The darkness was absolute, and in the silence that followed, I could hear only my ragged breathing and the pounding of my heart. And then, a low, rumbling laugh echoed through the room. It was deep, distorted, unnatural. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. The sound rattled my bones, sinking into my flesh like cold iron. The temperature dropped even further, until I could see my breath, a thin cloud of mist swirling in the air in front of me. I had to finish the ritual. I had to free them. But the more I tried to concentrate, the more the shadows seemed to resist. They twisted and writhed, as though alive, and the figures they formed in the darkness seemed to grow larger and more menacing by the second. The room began to spin. My vision blurred. The walls seemed to stretch outwards, the space around me warping, as if the building itself was alive, feeding off my fear. I gripped the table in front of me, trying to steady myself, but my hands were slick with sweat, my fingers numb with cold. I reached for the candles, but the flames danced wildly, casting long, distorted shadows that seemed to leer at me, mocking me. The floor beneath me trembled, and I could hear the sound of something scraping across the room, a heavy, dragging sound, as if something was moving towards me. I turned to face the door, but before I could take a step, it slammed shut with a deafening bang. The noise reverberated through my skull, making my ears ring. I could feel the energy in the room shifting, the darkness pressing in, thick and suffocating. "Leave," the voice growled, a low rasp that sent a tremor through my body. "You are not welcome here." But there was nowhere to go. The shadows surrounded me, their icy touch burning through the fabric of my clothes, freezing my skin. I couldn't run. I couldn't escape. The ritual, the office, the spirits, everything had become one, and I was caught in the center of it. The shadows were closing in on me. The air felt thick, suffocating, as if the office itself was trying to swallow me whole. My heartbeat pounded in my chest, each thump echoing like a drumbeat in the oppressive silence. I could hear the faint sound of shuffling, the scraping of furniture against the floor, but when I turned to look, nothing was there. It was as if the very walls were closing in on me, the building itself coming alive with a malevolent intent. The desk in front of me suddenly jerked forward, scraping loudly across the floor. The sound was jarring, as if the legs of the furniture were protesting against some unseen force. I froze, my eyes wide with fear, watching as the chair I had been sitting in moments before spun around on its own, the metal legs screeching as if in agony. I stepped back, my feet stumbling over each other, my mind racing for an explanation. But no rational thought could settle my nerves. The room was alive with movement. The chairs, the desks, the filing cabinets, they all shifted, subtly at first, then with increasing force, as if something was tugging them, pulling them across the room. I could hear the groan of the floorboards beneath the weight, the screeching metal, the hollow thud of wood on wood. I turned to face the corner of the room, my eyes wide with dread. There, in the dim light of the flickering bulbs, I could see something moving, something dark, something that didn't belong. A shape, tall and thin, crouched in the corner. I couldn't make out the details, but I knew, deep in my gut, that it was no ordinary shadow. It was the outline of something that was once human. The room was filling with whispers again, low and guttural, too distorted to make out clearly, but I could feel their intent. They were here. The spirits of the family, their presence overwhelming, their anger palpable. I could sense them all around me, their cold fingers brushing against my neck, their icy breath ruffling my hair. They weren't just haunting the building, they were in it, trapped within the very bones of the office. And now, they were angry. Furious. A sudden crash echoed through the space, as one of the filing cabinets was wrenched open with an unnatural force. Papers flew into the air, scattering across the room like confetti, and the cabinet itself began to tilt dangerously. I could hear the creaking of metal as it swayed, then, another crash, the heavy cabinet fell to the floor with a deafening thud. The noise reverberated through the walls, shaking the very foundation of the building. I didn't know what to do. My mind raced, but there was no way to escape. Every door seemed sealed, every window out of reach. And the shadows, those dark, ever-shifting shapes, were closing in. I felt a sudden pressure in my chest, a suffocating weight that made it hard to breathe, as if the very air itself was being sucked out of the room. And then, I heard it. A low, gravelly voice, coming from nowhere and everywhere at once, the sound like nails on a chalkboard. "Leave, leave now, or you will never leave." The voice was familiar. I had heard it before, an echo of the words on the computer screen. But now it was more than just text. It was real. The presence in the room, no longer just a threat in the shadows, was speaking to me, mocking me, warning me. The spirits weren't just angry, they were vengeful. And they weren't going to let me go. I felt the temperature drop even further, the cold wrapping around me like an icy shroud. The whispering voices grew louder, more insistent, their words growing frantic. You are ours. You are ours. I turned to flee, but the door slammed shut with such force that I was thrown back against the wall. My breath caught in my throat as I scrambled to my feet, my mind racing for a way out. But it was too late. The spirits were closing in, their whispers becoming screams. The room was spinning, the walls bending and warping as if the very fabric of reality was unraveling. The office wasn't just a place anymore. It was a prison, a tomb. And I was trapped inside with the restless souls of the family that had died here, their anger and rage festering like an open wound. The furniture continued to move, the shadows continued to stretch, and the air grew heavier with each passing second. I was running out of time. But where could I run to? There was no escape. The office had become their domain, their world. And now, it was mine too. In that moment, I realized the full horror of what had happened. The family's tragic death, their refusal to leave their land, had cursed this place. Their spirits had been bound to this office, to this very building, and now they were taking their revenge on anyone who dared to enter. I tried to move, to break free, but my limbs felt like they were made of stone, my body frozen in place by the oppressive weight of the spirit's fury. The shadows reached out, brushing against me, and I knew, without a doubt, that if I didn't find a way to escape soon, I would become one of them. One of the lost, the vengeful. The door began to tremble. I could hear it rattling on its hinges, the wood groaning as if the spirits were trying to tear it down. The cold increased, numbing my fingers, my feet, my very soul. The shadows closed in, thick and suffocating, until I could hardly breathe. I was no longer sure if I was running from the shadows, or if I had already become part of them. Panic surged through me, faster than I could comprehend. My heart raced, my breath shallow and rapid, as if the very act of breathing was a struggle. The air was stifling, thick with the oppressive weight of the spirit's anger. My hands trembled uncontrollably as I reached for the door handle, desperate to escape, but it wouldn't budge. I yanked on the door with all the strength I had, but the metal lock was unyielding, as if it had fused with the frame, unbreakable. My pulse thundered in my ears, the sound of it drowning out the whispers, the scratching noises that filled the room. The cold seeped through my clothes, freezing my bones, yet my body was drenched in sweat. Every movement felt like I was sinking into quicksand, too slow, too late. I pounded my fists against the door, my desperation growing with each failed attempt. The door remained firmly shut, as though something, or someone, on the other side was holding it in place, preventing my escape. I stepped back, trying to collect myself, but my mind was clouded with terror. The shadowy figures were drawing closer, their forms flickering and warping like twisted reflections in a cracked mirror. The room felt smaller, the walls inching in around me. I turned frantically, looking for another way out. The windows were just as useless, sealed shut with layers of grime and dust. There was no way to break through them, not with the supernatural forces weighing down on me. The silence between the whispers was deafening, broken only by the occasional rustle of movement in the corner of my eye. I heard a faint creak, the sound of a floorboard shifting under unseen footsteps. The shadows in the corners of the room began to stretch outwards, as though reaching for me, pulling the air away from my lungs. I could feel them closing in, inch by inch, their cold presence like fingers tightening around my chest, squeezing the life out of me. Leave now, or you'll never leave. The voice whispered, its words chilling me to the bone, and I realized with horror that I wasn't just hearing the spirits. They were inside my mind, speaking directly to me, weaving their fear into my thoughts. The walls seemed to close in, not physically, but mentally, I was trapped. There was no escape. Not physically. Not mentally. I turned back to the door, my hands shaking uncontrollably as I tried again, desperately pulling on the handle, my body screaming for freedom. I could feel the weight of invisible eyes on me, watching, waiting for me to give up. My fingers slipped, slick with sweat, and I stumbled back. My head was spinning, my chest tightening with every breath I took. And then, suddenly, the air shifted. The cold was gone, replaced by a warmth so intense it felt suffocating. The temperature was rising, the heat pressing down on me like an unbearable weight. I gasped, trying to push the door open one more time, but the room was growing smaller by the second. The walls were closing in again, not with the physical weight of the building, but with the suffocating pressure of the spirit's presence. The whispers grew louder, no longer just murmurs, but full voices now, voices that I could almost understand. Their words were a jumble of fury, their anger so palpable that it felt like I was being suffocated by it. They were all around me now, the shadows thickening, their shapes more solid, more real. I turned and stumbled towards the far corner of the room, hoping, praying that I could find a way out, but there was nothing there. Just more darkness. More shadows. And then, in the middle of it all, a figure appeared. It was faint at first, just a silhouette, but it solidified in an instant. A tall, thin shape with an unmistakable presence. The figure was dark, featureless, except for one thing, the eyes. The eyes that glowed with an unnatural, spectral light. My body froze in terror. The figure was watching me, and I could feel its gaze like ice on my skin. It was the spirit of the one who had died here, the one who had been wronged. I had seen its form before, in the reflection on the photograph. And now, it was here, in front of me, blocking my escape. I opened my mouth to scream, but no sound came. My voice was trapped inside me, the air pressing down on me harder than ever. The figure stepped forward, its movements slow, deliberate, as if savoring my fear. "Leave this place," it whispered, its voice raspy, torn, as though it had been dragged through centuries of suffering. "You are not welcome here. You never were." I could barely breathe. I felt the door behind me, but I couldn't bring myself to touch it again. It was as though I had no control over my own body anymore. The spirit's presence was suffocating, and I was paralyzed with fear, unable to move, unable to think. I had nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. "You cannot leave," the figure said again, this time with more certainty. "None of us can leave." The words hung in the air like a final verdict. The realization hit me like a thunderclap. There was no escape. There never would be. The office, the building, the land, they were all cursed, trapped in the past, and now I was part of that curse. As I collapsed to my knees, my mind screamed for release, but it was too late. The door remained locked, the shadows closed in, and the spirits, they had already claimed me. The room was thick with a sense of finality, the oppressive weight of the spirit's presence bearing down on me. My hands were shaking as I held the final candle, the flame flickering weakly in the cold, stale air of the office. Sweat streamed down my face, mingling with the tears that I could no longer control. Every fiber of my being screamed for release, for escape, yet I knew that the only way to end this, if there was even a way to end it, was to complete the ritual. I had set up everything as the occultist had instructed, the salt circles, the sacred symbols, the candles arranged in a perfect arc around the center of the room. The chants, the prayers, the invocations, they felt empty now, hollow in my throat, as if the words themselves had lost all meaning. I couldn't even hear myself as I recited the final verses. The air felt like it was vibrating, as if the building itself were trembling with the force of the spirits that had been awakened. There was no turning back. I muttered the final words, my voice barely above a whisper. Release them. Let them go. As soon as the last syllable left my lips, the candles flickered violently, their flames spiraling upward. The temperature dropped even further, and I saw my breath in the air, heavy and clouded. The shadows that had been hanging like thick curtains around me started to writhe, twisting and shifting in unnatural shapes. And then, for a brief moment, there was silence. A complete, all-consuming stillness. The silence was worse than the noises, worse than the whispers. It felt like the calm before a storm, like the universe itself was holding its breath, waiting for something. I stood motionless, waiting for the sign that the ritual had worked, that the spirits had been freed, that the nightmare would end. But the sign didn't come. Instead, the shadows began to form into shapes, thickening, becoming more defined. I saw faces, horrible, contorted faces twisted in silent screams. I saw hands reaching toward me, fingers clawing through the air as if they were trying to grab hold of me. I stumbled back, my legs weak and unsteady, my heart hammering in my chest. The floor beneath me groaned as if it, too, were alive, reacting to the torment of the spirits still trapped in this place. The lights overhead flickered and buzzed, the glow casting sickly shadows across the room. And then came the sound, soft at first, like a whisper, a breath, but growing louder, clearer, more desperate. The voices of the spirits, their cries, their pleas for release. I thought I had set them free. I thought the ritual had worked. But nothing had changed. The building was still filled with the same darkness, the same suffocating cold. In the dim light, I saw something move in the corner of my eye, a figure, pale and gaunt, watching me from the far end of the room. Its eyes glowed with that same eerie, spectral light. I froze, my blood turning to ice in my veins. "You did not listen," the figure said, its voice a low rasp that scraped against my skin. "You cannot free us. We are bound here, and you are bound with us." I took a step back, but the figure's gaze was fixed on me, unblinking, unrelenting. I tried to speak, to protest, but no words came. The truth hit me like a punch to the gut. I hadn't freed them. I had only brought their attention to me. My chest tightened with a deep, suffocating pressure. My breath came in shallow gasps as I looked around, realizing the full extent of my failure. The ritual had not released the spirits. It had only confirmed their hold on me, drawing me deeper into the web they had spun around this place. The figure slowly advanced, its form flickering, its presence growing stronger. "You thought you could escape," it hissed, its voice thick with venom. "You thought you could sever the ties, but you are as much a part of this as we are now." The walls seemed to close in around me again. The temperature plummeted further, the cold seeping into my bones, numbing my hands, my legs, my very soul. The light from the candles was barely aglow now, lost in the growing darkness, and the shadows continued to stretch, swallowing the last remnants of warmth. I turned to the door once again, hoping, praying that it would open this time. But it remained as locked as before, the handle cold and unyielding in my grasp. The windows were no better, sealed tight, a cage I couldn't escape from. I had done everything right. I had followed the instructions. But I had missed something, some crucial element that I couldn't understand. And now, the spirits were taking their toll, dragging me down into the same eternal torment they had suffered. I felt a cold hand brush my shoulder, and then another. And then a voice, quiet and cold, whispered directly into my ear. "You will never leave. You are one of us now." The room spun, my vision blurred, and I realized with terrifying clarity that this place, this office, was not just haunted, it was a prison. And I was its newest occupant. The office looked normal. Too normal. As if the events of the past few days, the horror I had endured, were nothing but a fleeting nightmare. I sat at my desk, my hands still shaking slightly, my mind a whirlwind of confusion. The cold, the shadows, the whispers, they seemed to have vanished, as though they had never been there in the first place. The familiar hum of the office returned, the clatter of keyboards, the distant murmur of conversations, the smell of stale coffee in the air. I looked around, trying to convince myself that it was real, that everything was fine. The fluorescent lights overhead flickered occasionally, but it was the kind of flicker you'd expect in any old office building. The chairs creaked under the weight of my colleagues, but no one seemed to notice anything out of the ordinary. No one seemed to be affected by the lingering, suffocating sense of dread that still gnawed at my insides. It was like the calm after a storm. But this calm didn't feel right. It felt like the eye of a hurricane, silent and serene on the surface, but with destruction waiting just beyond the horizon. I glanced at my colleagues. They went about their work as usual, typing away at their computers, having hushed conversations by the coffee machine. Some of them even smiled. A few offered greetings as they passed by, but no one seemed to notice how strained my smile was, how hollow my gaze. No one seemed to see the subtle change in me, the way my hands trembled whenever I touched something, the way my eyes darted nervously at every movement in the corner of the room. "Are you all right?" Megan, a colleague from the marketing department, asked, pausing beside my desk. Her voice was kind, but there was a strange emptiness in her tone, like she was saying the words because it was expected of her, not because she truly cared. I forced a smile. "Yeah, just tired, I guess." She nodded, her eyes shifting to the stack of papers in front of me. "Don't overwork yourself. You look like you've seen a ghost." The irony wasn't lost on me, and I had to fight the urge to laugh bitterly. Ghosts. I had seen more than my fair share. More than anyone should. But I didn't say anything. Instead, I just nodded, watching her walk away. I let out a long, shaky breath once she was out of earshot, my gaze once again drifting to the corners of the office. The shadows in those corners seemed to linger just a little longer than they should, and for a brief moment, I thought I saw something move. I blinked, and it was gone. I couldn't shake the feeling that the calm was only temporary. That something was waiting just beneath the surface, biding its time. But for now, everything seemed fine. The office was back to its usual routine, and no one else seemed to notice the tension in the air, the way the walls themselves felt heavy, as if they were closing in on me again. I looked back at my computer screen, trying to focus, trying to convince myself that everything was okay. But as my fingers hovered over the keys, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that the spirits were still there, and that they were waiting for the right moment to return. The days that followed felt like a strange blur, the rhythm of life in the office returning to normal, but something within me had shifted. I couldn't put my finger on it, but I knew I wasn't the same. The events, the ritual, the terror of that night, it had all left a mark on me, something invisible yet palpable. I found myself withdrawn, speaking less and less. Where I once had lively conversations with my colleagues, now I kept to myself. I no longer participated in the usual office banter, didn't join the lunch outings or coffee breaks. I would sit at my desk, staring at the screen, lost in thoughts I couldn't escape. The blinking cursor became my only companion, a reminder of how far I had fallen into this dark, unknown place. At first, no one said anything. But soon, I noticed the looks, quick glances when I passed by, whispers when I wasn't around. The quiet murmur of concern was palpable. Megan, who had asked if I was all right before, started giving me sideways glances, as though she were unsure of what to say. I saw her look at me more often than not, the worry in her eyes growing with each passing day. "Are you sure you're feeling okay?" she asked one afternoon, her voice tentative as she approached my desk. I wasn't sure how to respond. Was I okay? Could I even say I was, when I could still feel the weight of the spirits pressing down on me, their unseen eyes following my every move? "I'm fine," I muttered, my voice quiet, too quiet. "Just a little tired, I guess." She frowned slightly, but said nothing. She didn't seem convinced, but she walked away without pressing further. I couldn't help but notice how everyone seemed to be treading lightly around me, as if they could sense the change. The space around me felt colder, more distant, and I couldn't help but wonder, was it just me, or had I become someone else? Had I become the thing that haunted this place? The sounds of the office seemed to intensify, too. Every click of the keyboard felt louder than before, every distant conversation echoed through the quiet in a way that made me uncomfortable. It was as if the walls themselves were listening, waiting for something. Or maybe it was just my mind playing tricks on me. I began avoiding eye contact, shrinking further into myself. I noticed how my colleagues, who once would have greeted me with a smile or a joke, now spoke to me in clipped, careful tones. There was a hesitance in their words, a kind of wariness. They were cautious, almost afraid to be too close to me, as if they feared the same darkness that seemed to cling to me now would consume them too. The whispers at the water cooler grew louder. I could hear fragments of conversations as I walked past, snippets of concern about me. Is he all right? He's not like he used to be. Do you think something's wrong? I pretended not to hear. I pretended that I didn't notice the way people avoided me, the way they subtly gave me more space, as if trying to keep some kind of invisible distance between us. But inside, I could feel it. The walls closing in, the suffocating pressure of something I couldn't explain. Something had changed, and I was no longer sure who I was anymore. I used to think it was just the office that was haunted. But now I wondered, was it me? Was I the one who had become the ghost in this place? The calm I had hoped for never truly came. Despite the ritual, despite everything I had done to try and banish the spirits, they lingered. I could feel them, watching, waiting, even though the office was still, the air still, like nothing had happened. I tried to convince myself it was all in my head. I really did. But it became impossible to ignore. The shadows at the edge of my vision, the cold spots that never seemed to leave, the soft whispers that seemed to float just beyond my hearing, these things didn't go away. They only grew more persistent. It started with the flickering lights again, the subtle hum of electricity growing louder in my ears. I couldn't explain why, but I would be sitting at my desk, trying to focus on my work, when the light above me would flicker, just for a moment, and I would feel a sudden chill in the air. At first, I thought it was the building's wiring. But then it happened again. And again. Each time, the chill would return. And each time, it felt colder, like someone, was standing just behind me, breathing down my neck. But it wasn't just the lights. It was the way the shadows shifted in the room. I would be walking past the hallway, and out of the corner of my eye, I'd see a figure standing in the darkness. When I'd turn, there would be nothing there, just the empty hall. But the feeling would linger, like the figure had never left, just waiting for me to turn around again. I could hear them too. The soft creak of the floorboards when no one was walking, the faint rustle of fabric, the sound of something or someone moving in the shadows. Once, I swore I heard my name whispered in a voice so soft it almost sounded like a breeze. Derek, it came from nowhere, and yet I could feel it echo through my bones, sending shivers up my spine. The worst part was how it was all becoming too familiar. It was like the spirits were toying with me, pushing the boundaries of my sanity. The moments when I thought I was alone, when I thought the office was empty, I could hear footsteps behind me. Slow, deliberate, as if someone was walking just a few steps behind me, but when I would turn, the hallway would be empty. I began to wonder if anyone else noticed. Megan, who had once asked me if I was okay, was now more distant. Her eyes would occasionally flick to me with that same strange hesitation, but she never asked again. It was as if we were all pretending nothing was happening, and that, in itself, was worse than anything I had felt before. One evening, after everyone had left for the day, I stayed behind to go through some reports. The office felt quieter than usual, the stillness more oppressive. I was lost in my thoughts when I heard it, the soft rustling of papers. My head snapped up, my heart skipping a beat. I was alone. No one else was here. Yet, the papers on the desk next to mine were shifting, the edges curling as if someone invisible was sifting through them. I stood frozen. The room grew colder, the temperature dropping like a sudden gust of wind. The hairs on my neck stood on end, and I could feel my chest tightening. I had to leave. But no matter how hard I tried to move, I couldn't tear myself away from the sight. The papers on the desk settled, and I swore I saw something, a figure, move just outside my peripheral vision. I turned quickly, my breath shallow, my heart racing, but there was nothing. Just the shadows in the corners of the office. And the faintest whisper, "We are still here." I left the office that night, but the feeling of being followed, of being watched, clung to me. Even now, as I sit in my apartment, I can't shake the sensation that something is lurking just out of sight, just behind the walls, waiting for me to turn around. I had completed the ritual. I had done everything I was supposed to do, but I couldn't escape it. The spirits hadn't been freed. They were still here, with me, in the office, in my mind, in the very air I breathed. And it was clear now, I would never be free. I didn't know what to believe anymore. The line between reality and my imagination had blurred, so much so that I couldn't distinguish one from the other. Were these manifestations truly happening, or was my mind playing cruel tricks on me? Was I losing my grip on reality, spiraling deeper into some kind of madness? I couldn't tell. Each day felt like a surreal version of itself. The office seemed so ordinary, so normal, yet beneath the surface, something was wrong. My colleagues were still there, going about their routines, their conversations, their little jokes. But there was something different in the air, something I couldn't explain. I couldn't look at anything without feeling that subtle unease creeping in, that sensation that everything around me was somehow off. The flickering lights, the cold spots, the voices I swore I heard when no one was around, was it all just a product of my imagination? Perhaps it was the stress, the constant tension in the office, the fear that had followed me after the ritual. Maybe my mind was playing tricks on me, desperately trying to make sense of the fear I couldn't shake. I thought about the past few weeks. The whispers, the shadows, the feeling of being watched, it could have all been in my head. After all, no one else seemed to notice. The office remained as it had always been, quiet, routine, a place of work. And yet, the weight of those unseen eyes, the whispers just beyond hearing, made me question everything. I tried to tell myself it was just stress. Just the pressure of the office, the long hours, the isolation. Maybe I had been so consumed by fear that I convinced myself of things that weren't real. But then I would hear it again. A soft click of a keyboard when no one was typing, a faint shuffle of feet in the hallway when I was alone. It was so subtle, but it was always there, always just at the edge of my awareness. There were nights when I would sit in the office, staring at the screen, trying to focus on work, and the noise, the soft, insistent noise, would start. A tapping, like fingers on a desk, or the shuffle of someone walking in the corner of my eye. I would turn, but there would be nothing. Nothing at all. And I would wonder, in that brief moment, if it had all been real. If it was all still happening. Or if it was just me, slowly losing my mind. I tried to find logic in it. Perhaps the building had a history, a reputation for strange occurrences. Maybe there were things about this place that no one had told me. But why didn't anyone else seem to notice? Why didn't anyone else hear the footsteps in the hall or see the fleeting shapes in the shadows? I even tried to speak to Megan again, but when I brought it up, she grew quiet, looking at me as if she didn't know what to say. She didn't ask about the strange occurrences, and I didn't press her. Something in the way she looked at me told me she knew something, but she wasn't willing to talk about it. The silence between us stretched, heavy with unspoken words. I began to question myself. Was it real? Was I really seeing things, hearing things, feeling things that weren't there? Or was this some kind of twisted game, a cruel reminder from the spirits that I could never escape? Had the ritual done nothing? Had it failed? Or had it all been just a way to make me doubt my own sanity? The more I tried to understand, the more confused I became. The only certainty left was the feeling of being trapped. Trapped in a place where reality and the supernatural merged, where every sound, every shadow, every fleeting image filled me with dread. The office, once a place of routine and familiarity, had become something else entirely. It was no longer just a workplace. It was a place where the boundaries between the living and the dead were thin, where every corner hid something I couldn't quite grasp. I looked at the clock, another late night. I had to leave, I knew that. But even as I packed my things, that nagging feeling remained, pulling at the edges of my mind. Was I seeing things? Or was I being haunted by something far worse than I could ever have imagined? And then, as I turned to leave, I heard it again. A soft whisper, right behind me, "You're still here." I didn't want to talk to anyone anymore. At first, I tried to explain it to myself, to rationalize what had been happening. But the more I tried, the less sense it made. It felt like a weight pressing down on me, one that I could never escape. Every time I tried to interact with my colleagues, to engage in normal conversation, it felt like I was playing a part in some kind of twisted charade. I was no longer part of their world, no longer part of the world I had once known. The isolation was not just physical. It was mental, emotional. I couldn't bear the thought of explaining what I was going through, and I couldn't bring myself to look them in the eye anymore. They didn't see what I saw. They didn't hear the things I heard. How could they? They were all untouched by whatever it was that had begun to consume me. I stayed at the office late into the night. Sometimes I would lock myself in my small cubicle, trying to pretend that the world outside didn't exist. The office, with its stale air and buzzing fluorescent lights, had become a sanctuary of sorts, a place where I could retreat into my own mind. But even here, I couldn't escape. The whispers, the shadows, they were always there, lurking just beneath the surface. And no matter how much I tried to shut them out, they always found their way back in. The loneliness was crushing. I could see it in the eyes of my colleagues when they tried to engage with me. They were concerned. I knew that. They noticed the change, the tension that radiated off me. But I didn't want their concern. I didn't want anyone to know. I couldn't bear the thought of anyone seeing what had become of me. What if they thought I was losing my mind? What if they knew what was really happening and they blamed me for it? I started to avoid social gatherings, skipping lunch with the others, taking the stairs instead of the elevator to avoid seeing them in the hallways. It was easier to be alone, easier to just retreat into my own little world where the terrifying reality of the office could be kept at bay, if only for a while. But even in the solitude of my own thoughts, the presence never left. The coldness, the feeling of being watched, it was constant. It followed me, even when I tried to escape. There were moments when I'd be sitting at my desk, trying to focus on work, and the shadows in the corners of my vision would stretch, darken, grow more defined. The office had become a prison, a place where I couldn't escape, no matter how far I retreated into myself. I stopped answering phone calls, stopped replying to emails. I became a ghost in the office, drifting from task to task with no real connection to anything or anyone. I could hear the murmurs of my colleagues from a distance, their hushed conversations filled with concern. I knew they were talking about me, but I couldn't bring myself to care. I had become so numb, so detached, that I couldn't even muster the strength to defend myself. The worst part was that I knew something was wrong. I knew that the longer I stayed in that office, the closer I was getting to losing myself completely. I could feel the pull of something darker, something ancient, something that wouldn't let me leave. I could hear it in the silence, feel it in the air. I had become part of the very thing I had been running from. It was no longer just about the spirits, the ghosts of the family who had been wronged. It was about the slow, insidious erosion of my own sanity. I could hear the whispers in my mind now, a constant hum of voices, urging me to stay, urging me to join them. It wasn't enough to just be haunted by the past. I had become a part of it. I knew I couldn't keep going like this. I had to face it. I had to confront whatever it was that had taken root in my life. But every time I tried, I felt myself slipping further away from reality. The isolation was all-consuming, and every day felt like a battle I was losing. The walls were closing in, the darkness creeping closer, and I was terrified that I might not make it out. But the worst part was that I couldn't tell anyone. I couldn't let them see what was happening to me. Because I knew that if I did, I might never be the same again. I couldn't stay any longer. It had been building up for weeks now, this gnawing feeling, this constant pressure weighing down on me. The nightmares were getting worse, the whispers in my head growing louder. I had tried to ignore them, to push through, but the truth was undeniable now. I was trapped. Trapped in this office, trapped by the curse, trapped by my own mind. I had to get out. Today was supposed to be my last day. I had made up my mind. I would leave Virginia. I would leave everything behind, and I would never look back. I couldn't stand to be in that building any longer. The walls felt like they were closing in on me, and the silence was suffocating. I had spent so many sleepless nights, so many empty hours staring at the same desk, hearing the same whispers, that I could barely tell where the office ended and where my mind began. But this time was different. This time, I was going to take control. I was going to pack my things, walk out that door, and never return. I had my bag ready, everything packed, documents, my personal items, anything that had once tied me to this place. I was ready to leave it all behind. As I sat there at my desk, looking around one last time, a strange calm came over me. It was as if all the tension in the air had suddenly dissipated. Maybe it was the idea of finally leaving, or maybe it was the finality of the decision, but for the first time in weeks, I felt like I could breathe. The whispers were quieter today, the shadows less oppressive. It almost felt normal again, almost. I stood up, ready to gather the last of my things, but as I moved to collect my bag, I felt it. The cold. The unmistakable chill that had followed me since the first night I'd stayed late in the office. It swept over me, freezing the air, and I knew instantly that I wasn't alone anymore. Not in the way I had hoped. I turned, and there it was, right in front of me. The figure stood by the door. It wasn't fully visible, not in the way a living person would be, but it was there, just beyond the edges of my vision. The air seemed to thicken around it, the shadows deepening as if the darkness itself was alive and moving. I froze, heart pounding, my breath caught in my throat. I couldn't move. I couldn't look away. The figure stepped forward. Slowly, deliberately. It wasn't just a ghost, not a simple apparition. It was them, the family. The ones who had been wronged, the ones who had never left. They had come for me. I could feel the pressure mounting. My mind raced, searching for an escape, but there was none. The office felt like a cage, and the figures were closing in on me. I could hear them now, their voices blending together, murmuring in a language I couldn't understand, their tone both mournful and angry. "Leave," I whispered, my voice barely a breath. But they didn't leave. Instead, they stepped closer, their presence more solid now, more real. It wasn't just an illusion anymore. They were here. And I was no longer in control. The air was thick with their energy, and I could feel it seeping into me. I could feel their anger, their sorrow, their desperation. It was as if they were trying to communicate, to pull me into their world. I could feel my legs trembling beneath me, my hands going cold, my mind spiraling into panic. I turned, desperate to escape, but the door I had been so sure would be my exit, was no longer there. The hallway, the escape route, had disappeared. It was just a wall, solid and unyielding. I was locked in, trapped with them. And then, the whispers stopped. For one horrible moment, everything went quiet. The air was so still, so thick, I couldn't breathe. And then, slowly, I heard it, a voice, clear and unmistakable, echoing through the silence. "You can't leave." I didn't know if it was their voice, or if it was my own mind breaking under the weight of it all. But I knew in that instant that I was never going to leave this place. Not alive. Not whole. And so, as I stood there, unable to move, unable to escape, I realized the truth. The office, the building, the land, it had never been mine to leave. And now, I was part of it. Forever. The last thing I felt was the cold. The last thing I heard was their collective whisper. The last thing I knew, before everything went dark, was that I was no longer a person. I had become a part of the curse. The clock on the wall ticked on, but it felt like time had stopped. My heart hammered in my chest, each beat echoing in the hollow silence of the office. I had come to this place thinking I could escape, thinking I could outrun whatever haunted me here. But as I stood there, frozen, my eyes locked onto the shadowy figure before me, I knew I had been wrong. The figure, the spirit, was no longer just a vague shape at the edge of my vision. It was right there, in front of me. Solid, real, yet somehow intangible. The same figure I had seen countless times in my dreams, in my waking moments, in the dark corners of the office. It was them, the family whose death had caused this curse, whose restless spirits had been tied to this place. Their faces blurred, but their presence was undeniable. I felt an icy breath on the back of my neck, a cold wind swirling around me. The temperature dropped in the room, and I shivered involuntarily. The air felt dense, as if the very walls of the office were closing in, squeezing out any hope of escape. The sounds of the building, the hum of the lights, the tapping of the computer keys disappeared entirely. All that remained was the oppressive silence and the soft whispers of the spirits. The figure took another step toward me, and I felt my knees go weak. I stumbled back, but the figure followed, its presence relentless, closing on me with every passing second. The shadows deepened around it, forming shapes that seemed to move of their own accord. I could see vague, shadowy faces emerging from the darkness, faces that once belonged to the family. The mother, the father, and the children, each one staring at me with eyes full of sorrow, rage, and something far worse, recognition. They knew who I was. Why? I whispered, my voice trembling with fear. Why me? The mother's face was the clearest of them all. Her eyes, wide with grief and anger, seemed to pierce through me, locking me in place. Her lips moved silently at first, but then her voice broke through the stillness. It wasn't just words, it was a scream, a plea, a warning all rolled into one. You have taken what was not yours. The words resonated in my mind, seeping deep into my soul. I didn't understand. What had I taken from them? I was just a man trying to survive, trying to make sense of the chaos that had overtaken my life. The office, the whispers, the shadows, I never asked for this. But they were relentless. The father appeared beside her, his face just as tormented, his eyes hollow with rage. His voice joined hers, echoing in the silence like a thunderclap. This land is ours. You cannot escape what you have disturbed. The coldness in the room intensified, and the walls seemed to close in even more. My hands shook, and I tried to back away, but the space was shrinking. There was nowhere to go. No escape. The figures were closing in, surrounding me in a circle. It was as though the office itself had come alive, and it was alive with their fury. I could hear the soft shuffle of feet on the floor. No, it wasn't me. It was them. They were walking toward me, each step heavier than the last. I wanted to scream, to run, but my feet were frozen to the floor. Then, one by one, the spirits stepped forward. They reached out with their cold, invisible hands, their fingers brushing against me, sending waves of icy terror through my body. Each touch burned, not with pain, but with a searing chill that seemed to drain the life out of me. My breath became shallow as I gasped for air that had turned to ice. Their faces, still fading in and out, watched me intently, their presence suffocating. The mother reached out her hand, her ghostly fingers grazing my face. Her touch was like a weight on my chest, pushing me down. Her mouth moved, but the words she spoke were more felt than heard, like a scream buried deep in my soul. You cannot leave. Her voice was not a plea, it was a command, a final warning. In that moment, I realized something horrifying. I wasn't just being haunted. I wasn't just being watched. I was being claimed. The land, the office, the building itself, it was all part of the curse. I had walked into a place where the dead had been denied their peace, and now they were pulling me into their world. I had taken so much from them without knowing it. My presence, my life, had disturbed their eternal rest. And now, they would take everything from me in return. I could feel the last of my hopes slipping away. I wasn't just the victim of an office haunting. I was the final piece of the puzzle, the last living soul to be consumed by the curse. And as the shadows closed in around me, I understood I was never meant to leave. I had never been meant to escape. As the last echoes of the spirit's warning faded into the suffocating silence of the office, something shifted inside me. I no longer felt the cold just in my body. It spread through my mind, taking root in the very core of my being. The oppressive darkness that had been gathering in the corners of the room now seemed to seep into my thoughts, twisting and distorting everything I believed about reality. The figures, those faces, those shadows, weren't just haunting me. They were part of me now. I could feel their presence, not just in the office, but in the pit of my stomach, like a weight that refused to lift. My breath quickened, and my heart raced. I couldn't escape them. I had thought I could end it with a ritual, that somehow, by freeing the spirits, I would free myself. But I had been wrong. So terribly wrong. The room around me seemed to warp and bend, the once familiar walls now stretching and closing in. The floor beneath my feet felt unstable, as if the building itself was shifting, collapsing into some other realm. I heard whispers again, not just from the shadows, but from inside my own head, soft, insistent voices, murmuring words I couldn't quite catch. But one thing was clear, I wasn't going to escape this place. Not ever. The curse had already taken root inside me, and there was no running from it. No amount of rituals or prayers would change that. I slumped against my desk, my hands trembling as I clutched the edge, my mind reeling. It all came crashing down at once, the history of this land, the family's death, the malevolent force that had been unleashed. I could see their faces again, clearer now, more distinct. The family, the ones who had refused to sell. They were angry, yes, but there was something more, desperation. They had been trapped in this curse too, just like me. Their souls, twisted by rage and grief, had been bound to the land, forced to linger in torment. And now, so was I. I wanted to scream, to tear at my hair, to do anything to make it stop. But I couldn't. The curse wasn't just something that could be broken or fought. It wasn't something that could be escaped. It was alive, a part of the land, a part of the building, a part of me now. I had heard stories, rumors even, about people who had tried to leave haunted places only to be followed by the spirits they had disturbed. But this was something different. The curse had taken root so deeply within me that it wasn't just tied to the office or the land anymore. It was bound to my very existence. My hands, cold and numb, reached for the computer screen, almost as if guided by some unseen force. The keys felt foreign beneath my fingertips, as though they no longer obeyed my will. The screen flickered to life once more, and the same cold, haunting message appeared. You cannot leave. You belong here now. The words, so simple, yet so final, dug into my soul like a dagger. I wasn't just another victim of the curse. I was now part of it. Bound to the land, bound to the spirits who had never found peace. The office, the land, it was all connected, and I was tethered to it forever. I could feel them watching me. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw their faces, those faces twisted by anger and sorrow. Every shadow in the corner of my vision was another presence, another pair of eyes on me. I couldn't escape the feeling that they were inside me now, living in my thoughts, in my heart, in my very soul. What had started as a nightmare had become my reality. I would never be free. The curse would follow me wherever I went, whenever I tried to leave. It would haunt me in every corner of my life, creeping into my dreams, my thoughts, my actions. There was no escape. There was no redemption. And as I sat there, my mind slowly unraveling, I understood the truth. The curse wasn't just something that tied me to the office. It had become a part of who I was. It would follow me to the ends of the earth, never leaving, never releasing its grip on me. The family had been bound to this place, and now I was bound to them. Together, we would wander in the dark forever, our souls never at peace. There was no ending to this story. No escape. No salvation. It was over. And as the shadows in the corners of the room closed in once more, I realized that the curse had already claimed me. Forever. The darkness in the office seemed to thicken, closing in around me like a suffocating blanket. Every corner, every shadow felt alive, watching me, waiting. The more I tried to rationalize the events unfolding around me, the less it made sense. The spirits, the curse, had taken more than just my peace of mind. They had invaded every part of my existence, intertwining their fates with mine. It wasn't just about being haunted anymore. It wasn't just about hearing voices or seeing fleeting glimpses of faces in the dark. No, the curse had a greater hunger. And I was beginning to understand that hunger. It had started subtly, an overwhelming sense of being watched, the way the air would grow colder, how the computer screen would flicker to life with cryptic messages. But now, it was becoming something more. The shadows weren't just lingering in the corners of the office, they were growing, stretching, pulling at the fabric of my reality. I was being consumed from the inside out. I couldn't take it any longer. I needed to find a way out. But the longer I stayed, the more it felt like there was no escape. The spirits had made their intentions clear. I wasn't going anywhere. But maybe, just maybe, there was something I hadn't considered, something that could end this nightmare for good. It was late one evening, as I sifted through the old, dusty papers in the back of the office, trying to find anything that could explain what was happening, that I stumbled across something that made the air around me grow even colder. It was an old journal, its leather cover cracked and brittle with age. As I flipped through the pages, a feeling of dread washed over me. The handwriting was shaky, desperate. It belonged to someone from the family who had once lived here, the family that had been killed. They had written about their fear, their torment. And then, in the final pages, a revelation, a ritual. A twisted, dark ritual that could break the curse, but it required a sacrifice. The words were clear. In order to end the torment, one must remain. One must become the anchor, the vessel, the replacement for the restless spirits. Only then can the others be freed. My heart raced as I read those words. The idea was unfathomable. Someone had to stay behind. One soul had to remain bound to the land, to the office, while the others could leave. The spirits couldn't be freed without it. But who would be willing to make such a sacrifice? The truth was undeniable now. The curse wasn't just a consequence of the past. It was a living, breathing force that fed on the souls of those who came near. And I had been chosen, not to escape, but to take the place of someone else. The only way for the torment to end for the others was for someone to stay behind, someone to anchor the spirits to this place, forever. I sat back, my mind reeling. Who could I trust? How could I even explain this to someone? The burden of the decision was unbearable. I couldn't let anyone else suffer like this. But could I truly go through with it? Could I let someone else take my place, knowing what it meant? And what if it wasn't just one person who had to stay behind, but someone who had no choice but to be consumed by the curse entirely? The walls of the office seemed to close in on me again, the temperature dropping as the shadows whispered louder. I realized then that I had no choice. No one could escape this curse without it taking someone else in their place. And as much as I wanted to scream, to beg for a way out, the truth remained, the curse would never let me go. Not unless I did something I couldn't undo. The room felt oppressive, like a weight pressing on my chest, suffocating me. I understood what had to be done, what the curse demanded. But who could I sacrifice? Would anyone believe me? Would anyone step forward to take my place, knowing the horror they were about to face? I had no answers. But the spirits were growing restless, the air around me thick with their demands. The answer, I knew, was inevitable. And it would be my choice. Or perhaps, the curse had already made it for me. I had made up my mind. I would leave. It didn't matter if it meant leaving everything behind, my job, my friends, my life as I knew it. There was nothing else I could do. The weight of the curse, the oppressive presence of the spirits, it was too much to bear. I couldn't stay. I couldn't let the darkness consume me any further. So, I packed my things in a haste. I told myself that walking away was my only option. I had to get out before it was too late. The office had become my prison, and every inch of it felt like a chain wrapped tightly around my chest, strangling the last remnants of peace I had left. I could hear the whispers again, the soft hiss of voices that weren't mine, and the shuffling of feet that never touched the ground. The spirits were growing restless, but I couldn't allow their cries to stop me. I took one last look around the office. The dim lights flickered, casting eerie shadows that seemed to mock me. My heart raced. The air was suffocatingly cold now, and the walls seemed to close in, whispering their warning to me once again. I was so close. I could leave. I grabbed the door handle, pulling it with all my strength, but it wouldn't budge. Panic surged through me, a rush of adrenaline flooding my veins. I pulled again, harder, but the door remained firmly locked. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. The room seemed to warp around me, the walls pressing in tighter. The temperature plummeted, my breath turning to mist in the freezing air. That was why I saw it, the shadow at the far corner of the room. A shape, tall and indistinct, but unmistakably human. The outline of a figure, its form shifting and swirling like smoke, yet its eyes, those eyes, they were unmistakable. They were the eyes of the family that had once lived here. The eyes of the ones who had refused to sell their land, the ones who had died in a violent and senseless tragedy. My heart pounded in my chest, but I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. The presence in the room grew stronger, more oppressive, and I knew deep down that I had already made my choice. I had run, tried to escape, but the curse wasn't something you could outrun. The shadow moved closer. It wasn't just standing there anymore. It was walking toward me, its presence filling the room, suffocating every inch of space around me. I could feel its coldness seep into my bones. And then, I heard it, its voice. Low, guttural, a whisper that sounded like the rustling of dry leaves, but I understood its meaning. You can never leave. The words cut through me like a blade. I had known it all along. There was no escaping. No matter how far I ran, no matter how much I tried to fight, the curse would always follow. The spirits would never let me go. I turned to the door again, but the handle was no longer there. The walls were closing in faster now, and the ground beneath me felt like it was shifting, as if the very foundation of the building was being undone. The darkness was swallowing me whole. I tried to scream, to plead, but it was no use. The spirits were already taking me. I could feel their cold fingers wrap around my throat, dragging me into the blackness. I tried to fight, but it was futile. The office, the cursed land, had claimed me. The souls of the ones who had died here were not done with me yet. They had marked me from the beginning, and now it was my turn to become part of their torment. As the darkness consumed me, the last thing I saw was the faint outline of a door, but it was too far away now. It would always be just out of reach. The curse had come full circle. There was no escape. There was no going back. And I realized, too late, that the office had never been my prison, it had always been my grave. The last breath I took was cold, and the darkness never let me go. Thank you for making our stories part of your relaxation time. We hope they brought you a sense of peace and transported you to a world of fantasy and mystery. If you enjoyed the stories, feel free to leave us a review. Your feedback inspires us and helps us make the content even better. Now, unwind to the calming sounds of rain and thunderstorms, which will continue to set a tranquil mood. Let these sounds carry you gently into the realm of dreams. Don't forget to like our page if you haven't yet. Wishing you a restful night's sleep. Relax, rest well, and good night.